Hey there, tonight we're diving into the turbulent life of a 19th century sailor. Not the swashbuckling adventure you see in movies, but a world where hardtack biscuits might outlast your teeth. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. So, you're about to step onto a 19th century sailing ship, where the romanticized idea of adventure meets the stark reality of, well, living in a floating sardine tin. First things first, you might want to lower those expectations of spacious cabins and private quarters. Forget the luxury of a room to yourself. Here, it's more like sharing a broom closet with a dozen of your closest sailor buddies. The sleeping arrangements, hammocks strung tightly together, swinging gently with the sway of the ship, because nothing says good night's rest like the risk of waking up face first on the wooden deck. Now, let's talk about your paycheck. If you're thinking about making a fortune, think again. Sailors' wages were jaw-droppingly low. We're talking about $10 a month, and that's before any deductions for lost or damaged equipment. To put that into perspective, even in the 19th century, this was barely enough to scrape by. Compare this to a factory worker on land who might earn $20 to $30 a month. Suddenly, that shipboard adventure doesn't seem quite as lucrative, does it? And let's not gloss over the work schedule. You know how people say, working around the clock? Here, it's not just a saying, it's your life. The typical workday for a sailor stretched from dawn until the next dawn, with a few measly hours of sleep snatched between shifts. The watch system meant you were either on duty, waiting to be on duty, or trying to catch some shut-eye while your hammock swung like a pendulum. Oh, and those stormy nights. Yeah, they don't come with a get-out-of-work-free card. Now, onto the culinary delights awaiting you. If you thought you were in for gourmet sea meals, think again. Welcome to your new diet. Hardtack and salt pork. Hardtack, for the uninitiated, is basically a cracker that's so hard it could double as a makeshift weapon. Salt pork. Imagine meat that's been brined beyond recognition. Together, they're washed down with a splash of grog, a diluted rum concoction that was as much about keeping scurvy at bay as it was about keeping morale afloat. Spoiler alert, it didn't do a great job at either. But let's not forget the backdrop against which all this toil and trouble unfolds. The open sea. It's both a vast expanse of freedom and a relentless reminder of your isolation. The sea has no walls, but it sure knows how to toss you around, and when it gets angry, you'll know it. Those romantic tales of heroes and explorers. They didn't often mention the relentless seasickness, the punishing storms, or the very real threat of getting lost at sea, or worse, meeting a watery end. Now, here's the thing. Despite the less than glamorous conditions, there's an undeniable allure to life at sea. It's a blend of freedom and danger, camaraderie and hardship, and a sense of being part of something bigger, navigating the world by wind and sail, with nothing but the stars to guide you. It's a life that demanded resilience and grit, qualities that were as much a currency as the paltry wages. But before we sail too far into romanticizing, remember that this was a world where discipline was fierce, and hierarchy was everything. The captain ruled with an iron fist, and stepping out of line could land you in the brig or worse. Mutinies, while rare, were a testament to the extreme conditions sailors endured. The sea was as unforgiving as the discipline on board, making life a constant balancing act between survival and duty. So, there you have it, the gritty, unvarnished truth of 19th century seafaring life. It's not the stuff of fairy tales, but it is the reality that countless sailors lived and breathed. And while it's easy to get swept up in the romance of the high seas, it's the day-to-day grind, the camaraderie in the face of hardship, and the sheer will to keep going that truly define the life of a sailor. Welcome aboard, and hold on tight. This isn't a journey for the faint of heart. Speaking of journeys not for the faint of heart, let's dive into the murky waters of hygiene on a 19th century sailing ship. A subject that could turn even the saltiest sailor's stomach. If you think your gym locker room smells bad, try cramming dozens of unwashed bodies into a space barely big enough for a game of Twister. Bathing was a luxury, not a right. Fresh water was more precious than gold, reserved for drinking and cooking, so sailors often took a dip in the ocean. That's right. Bathing in seawater was seen as a special treat, although it didn't do much for the salt-crusted grime permanently embedded in their pores. And then there were the lice, the unofficial shipboard mascots. They were as common as seagulls, only less photogenic. Sailors could spend hours picking these unwelcome companions out of their hair and clothes, an exercise as futile as bailing out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. Lice infestations were so rampant that delousing became a communal event, a bonding activity of sorts. Forget team-building retreats. Nothing says camaraderie like picking bugs off your shipmate's scalp. But wait, there's more. The real MVPs of maritime maladies were the diseases that lurked around every corner. Think of a sailing ship as a floating petri dish, where germs had free rein. One of the most notorious afflictions was scurvy, a disease that turned strong men into walking corpses. Caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, scurvy was an equal opportunity destroyer, claiming the teeth of the rich and poor alike. Sailors' gums would swell and bleed, their teeth would loosen, and they would develop spots on their skin. If that sounds horrific, it was, and all for want of a few citrus fruits. You might wonder why these sailors didn't just pack some oranges. Well, fresh produce wasn't exactly easy to store on long voyages, and refrigeration was still a twinkle in the eye of future inventors. It wasn't until the late 18th century that British naval officer James Lind discovered that citrus fruits could prevent scurvy, leading to the British Navy's nickname, limeys, after they started carrying lime juice on board. But for most of the 19th century, sailors had to rely on whatever preserved rations they could scrounge, which were often about as nutritious as cardboard. Now, if you think modern medicine is bad, wait till you hear about 19th century shipboard medical care. Picture this. You have a toothache. What do? On land, you might visit the dentist. At sea, you could expect a hearty dose of rum and a pair of pliers. Tooth extraction was the go-to remedy, and it wasn't performed by a trained dentist, but rather by whoever was brave enough to wield the tools. And if you think that's bad, try contemplating surgery. The ship's surgeon, if there was one, was often an unqualified barber surgeon who learned his trade on the job. Amputation was the catch-all solution for any serious injury or infection. A broken leg, off it comes. Gangrene setting in. Say goodbye to that arm. Anesthesia. Forget about it. You got a shot of rum and a wooden stick to bite down on during the procedure. Recovery was a gamble, with infection lurking in every unsterilized corner. Of course, there were always the ever-faithful sailors' superstitions to lend a hand or a hook. Many believed that tattoos of religious symbols or mythical creatures could protect them from harm. Others swore by the power of amulets or special rituals to ward off illness and injury. In the absence of real medical knowledge, these beliefs provided comfort, a psychological balm in a harsh world. So, while the open sea might have offered the promise of adventure and discovery, it also delivered a hefty dose of grim reality. Life aboard a 19th century sailing ship was a constant battle with the elements, disease, and each other, punctuated by moments of breathtaking beauty and camaraderie. It was a world where survival depended on grit, luck, and a good dose of gallows humor. The romance of the high seas might have drawn you in, but it was the daily grind, the unrelenting hardships, and the sheer will to endure that kept you going. As we continue to explore the life of a sailor, remember, it's a tale as salty as the sea itself, with all the gritty details that history often glosses over. But here's where things really start to get spicy. The social dynamics aboard a 19th century sailing ship. If you thought high school had a strict pecking order, wait until you hear about life at sea. The hierarchy was as rigid as a ship's mast, and discipline wasn't just a suggestion. It was enforced with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for dog training. Leading this floating fiefdom was the captain, a figure who wielded more power than a Game of Thrones monarch. His word was law, and defying it could earn you a date with the cat o' nine tails, a fearsome whip that made misbehaving a painful memory, quite literally. The cat o' nine tails wasn't your average disciplinary tool. It was an instrument of terror with 9 knotted cords designed to tear into flesh. A sailor caught snoozing on the job, or worse, pilfering the captain's stash of rum, might find himself tied to the grating, awaiting a punishment that could range from a few lashes to a full-blown flogging. It was so common that the Royal Navy had an official flogging round the fleet, where sailors were paraded from ship to ship to receive their punishment in front of an audience. Now that's what you call a public service announcement. Moving down the ranks, you had the officers, petty officers, and the rest of the crew, each with their own roles and responsibilities. The officers, often from the upper echelons of society, were the captain's trusted aides, trained in navigation and command. Petty officers, meanwhile, were usually seasoned sailors who clawed their way up the ranks. As for the common sailors, they were the grunts who did the heavy lifting, literally. They hoisted sails, swabbed decks, and did the kind of grueling work that would make a cross-fit enthusiast break a sweat. It was back-breaking labor, and the only reward was the satisfaction of not being flogged. Now, let's talk about the press gangs, the not-so-subtle recruiters of the naval world. If you've ever had a headhunter call you out of the blue, imagine that scenario, but with more physical coercion and fewer linked-in endorsements. Press gangs were tasked with ensuring ships had enough crew, and they weren't picky. They'd roam the streets of port towns, snatching up any able-bodied man they could find. In some cases, they'd even kidnap unsuspecting men from taverns or off the streets, a practice known as impressment. This was less of a career choice and more of an involuntary vocational calling. One moment you're enjoying a pint, the next you're on a ship bound for the Caribbean, wondering what just happened to your life. The British Royal Navy was notorious for this practice, especially during times of war when manpower was desperately needed. Between 1793 and 1812, an estimated 100,000 men were pressed into service. And while there were legal loopholes, like carrying a protection certificate to prove you were exempt, these were about as effective as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. Impressment was so rampant it even contributed to the War of 1812, when the U.S. got fed up with British ships kidnapping American sailors. Now, let's debunk the myth of camaraderie at sea, that romantic notion that sailors were a band of brothers, like a seafaring version of Friends. Sure, there was some truth to this. After all, when you're stuck on a wooden boat in the middle of the ocean, you better get along, or at least tolerate each other. But the reality was often less rosy. The relentless hierarchy, coupled with harsh conditions, fostered resentment and tension among the crew. Mutinies, contrary to Hollywood portrayals, were not just dramatic plot devices, but rather a harsh reality. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, mutinies were more common than you'd think. The infamous mutiny on the HMS Bounty in 1789 was just one of many. Sailors had grievances, ranging from poor pay and brutal discipline to inadequate food and long voyages. It was desperation, not rebellion for rebellion's sake, that drove crews to take drastic action. The Bounty's mutineers, led by Fletcher Christian, set their captain, William Bligg, and 18 loyalists adrift in a small boat, a dramatic move born out of frustration, not just mutinous ambition. And while mutinies were the stuff of legend, they were also perilous gambits. If unsuccessful, the consequences were dire. The British Admiralty didn't take kindly to mutineers, and getting caught could mean a swift trial and an even swifter execution, often by hanging. The risk was as high as the stakes, and it underscored the desperation of those who dared to rise against their captains. So, while the open sea might have offered the promise of adventure and the allure of a fresh start, it also came with its own set of chains, social, physical, and psychological. The discipline was harsh, the hierarchy unyielding, and the threat of punishment ever-present. In this world, the romanticized camaraderie was not so much a given as it was a necessity for survival. After all, when the alternative to unity was a lashing or an untimely end, working together seemed like the only sane option. As we continue to navigate the turbulent waters of 19th century seafaring life, keep in mind that the romance of the high seas was often just a thin veneer over a much grittier reality. The adventure was real, but so were the hardships, and while the stories of camaraderie and heroism endure, they are inseparable from the harsh truths that defined this era of maritime history. Stay tuned, because there's plenty more to uncover on this journey through the salty tales of the past. As we sail into the choppy waters of 19th century maritime economics and politics, let's pull back the curtain on the real puppet masters of the high seas. Spoiler alert, it's not the dashing captains or the adventurous sailors, but rather the merchants and empires that saw the world as one giant, salty chessboard. And guess what? Sailors were just the pawns getting smacked around by the rooks and knights of trade and colonial ambition. First up, Let's talk money. Because, let's face it, if you want to understand what made those wooden leviathans creak and groan across the oceans, you have to follow the money trail. The 19th century was the age of global trade routes, a time when the world was being tied together with strings of commerce like some kind of planetary marionette. Think of it as globalization 1.0, where empires like the British and the Dutch were running the show, shipping everything from spices and tea to textiles and opium. Yeah, opium, because nothing says we care about your well-being like getting entire nations hooked on narcotics. Trade wasn't just a side hustle, it was the economic backbone of empires. In 1800, the British East India Company alone accounted for half of the world's trade. That's right, half. This corporate behemoth had its own private army and more influence than a modern-day Silicon Valley giant. They weren't just in it for the profits, but for the power that came with controlling entire regions. These companies built their fortunes on the backs of sailors, who navigated these perilous routes for a pittance, while the merchants counted their piles of gold. You see, these trade routes weren't just lines on a map. They were highways for imperial ambition. The British Empire, for instance, wasn't content with just peddling goods. No, they wanted to paint as much of the globe red as possible, and ships were the paintbrushes. The sun never set on the British Empire, they said, because they were too busy sailing around the world, taking other people's stuff. It's all about perspective, right? But let's not forget the human cost of these ambitions. The demand for sailors was insatiable, and since willing participants were as rare as a unicorn siding, impressment was the name of the game. Ships needed crews, and the merchant companies didn't care how they got them. Sailors were often thrust into this world without choice, and once on board, they were at the mercy of the company's demands. Ever heard of the phrase, company man? These guys took it to a whole new level, except the rewards were more akin to salty crackers than stock options. The relationship between sailors and merchant companies was about as stable as a Jenga tower in a hurricane. Profits were prioritized over crew welfare, with sailors often facing grueling conditions, sparse rations, and little protection. If a sailor fell ill or was injured, he was often left to fend for himself, as the company's bottom line wouldn't allow for compassion or benevolence. Maritime insurance, a laughable concept back then. It was more like a sink or swim policy, literally. Now, onto the geopolitical chessboard and how sailors found themselves smack in the middle of it. Famous naval battles like Trafalgar in 1805 weren't just about national pride. They were about controlling the seas for economic dominance. Admiral Horatio Nelson, that one-armed wonder of the British Navy, led his fleet to victory against the combined forces of France and Spain. But for every Nelson, there were thousands of anonymous sailors who faced cannonballs and disease with little more than a pat on the back and a promise of glory. Their sacrifices were the fuel for the nationalistic fire, but they were still just pieces in the grand game of empire building. These battles weren't fought for love or glory. They were fought over trade routes and the power they represented. Control the seas, control the world. That was the mantra. And while the admirals and emperors played their deadly games, the sailors were the ones who paid the price, often with their lives. It's like being the unsung hero in a blockbuster movie, except there's no happy ending, just a watery grave or a life of obscurity. So, while the allure of the high seas might have drawn many a dreamer to its depths, the reality was a harsh reminder that the world was ruled by those who held the purse strings. The romance of the adventure was often overshadowed by the grim reality of economic exploitation and geopolitical maneuvering. Ships were not just vessels of discovery. They were the engines of empire, driven by the sweat and blood of those who sailed them. And as we continue this journey through the turbulent world of 19th century maritime life, remember that behind every flag, every anthem, and every heroic tale, there were the untold stories of those who bore the brunt of ambition and greed. The sea was a stage, but the sailors were the ones who played the most perilous roles, their lives intertwined with the tides of history in ways both grand and tragic. Stay tuned, because the ocean's depths still hold many more stories, and we've only just begun to plumb their secrets. As we delve deeper into the salt-crusted layers of history, let's ponder why anyone would willingly subject themselves to the punishing life of a 19th century sailor. Despite the appalling conditions and the ever-present spectre of death by scurvy, storm, or the captain's ire, the sea held an irresistible allure. It wasn't just the promise of adventure or the romantic notion of freedom. It was an escape from the strictures of land-based life, a siren song of the unknown that whispered tantalizingly to those yearning for something beyond the horizon. Back then, society was about as flexible as a lead pipe. If you were born into a lower class, chances were you'd stay there, working the same fields or factory floors your parents did. But the sea promised something different. Here, a man could reinvent himself, shed the shackles of his past, and perhaps, with a bit of luck and a lot of grit, make a name for himself. In a world where social mobility was as rare as a unicorn in a top hat, the ocean offered a tantalizing possibility, the chance to be more than the sum of one's birth. And let's not forget the thrill of the chase. For many sailors, the high seas were a theater of the sublime and the terrifying. Each day was a gamble, a new hand dealt by the capricious sea, and for some, that uncertainty was invigorating. It was a heady cocktail of danger and discovery, where the stakes were life and death, and the prize was the world itself. Think of it as the ultimate reality show, only with fewer cameras and more krakens. But what about those sea shanties, you ask? Surely they were just a quaint way to pass the time, right? Not quite. They were the soundtrack of survival, a way to maintain rhythm and unity during back-breaking labor. Singing about a wellerman, bringing sugar and tea and rum, wasn't just a catchy tune. It was a lifeline, a shared narrative that connected sailors in a world where isolation was the only constant. These songs were a testament to human resilience, a reminder that even in the direst circumstances, we find ways to connect, to endure. Now, let's hoist the sails on the legacy of these seafaring souls. Their indomitable spirit and adaptability have left an indelible mark on modern maritime culture. Naval traditions, steeped in centuries of protocol and superstition, owe much to these hardy mariners. The custom of crossing the line ceremonies, where new sailors are initiated as true seafarers upon crossing the equator, dates back to this era. It's a nod to the rites of passage that shaped the identities of those who lived and died by the sea. And then there's the enduring allure of pirate lore, a genre that refuses to sink beneath the waves of historical fact. Pirates of the 19th century, figures like Blackbeard and Anne Barney, have achieved a kind of mythic immortality. Sure, their lives were brutal and often short, but they've been transformed into symbols of rebellion and freedom, a romanticized counter-narrative to the regimented life of a sailor. It's a curious twist of history that the very figures who once struck terror into the hearts of sailors and merchants alike are now celebrated in film and literature. But why do these stories still captivate us? Perhaps it's because they speak to a universal human desire for adventure and autonomy, to live by our own rules in a world that often imposes its own. Pirates, like the sailors they once preyed upon, represent a tantalizing what if, a life unbound by convention, driven by the same winds that powered the great ships of their time. So, as we lower the anchor on our exploration of 19th century maritime life, let's reflect on the resilience and adaptability of these men who braved the ocean's perils. Their legacy is a complex tapestry of hardship and hope, woven with threads of adventure, survival, and enduring human spirit. They remind us that history isn't just a series of dates and battles. It's a chronicle of human endeavor, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of overwhelming odds. The sailors of the 19th century may have been pawns in a larger game, but they were also the heart and soul of the maritime world. They were the ones who charted the unknown, who battled the elements, and who forged connections across the globe. Their stories, both the romantic and the gritty, continue to inspire us today, a testament to the enduring allure of the sea and the indomitable spirit of those who dared to sail it. And there we have it, folks, the real tale of 19th century sailors, stripped of the varnish of romanticism, but no less fascinating for it. It's a world where the pursuit of freedom came at a steep cost, where every horizon promised both peril and possibility, and where the ocean was both a prison and a path to something greater. So next time you hear the crash of waves or the call of a sea shanty, remember the men who ventured into the unknown, driven by the winds of fate and the promise of the sea. Frederick the Great's early years were like a soap opera set in the Prussian court, except with more wigs and fewer commercials. Let's jump straight into the drama. Young Fritz, as Frederick was known before he became the Great, had a father who could best be described as a militaristic drill sergeant with a royal crown. King Frederick William, I wasn't the type to win any Father of the Year awards. In fact, his approach to parenting was as subtle as a cannonball through a stained glass window. Now, Frederick William, I wasn't just any king. He was the soldier king, and he ran his household like a boot camp. He had a particular fondness for tall soldiers, known as the Potsdam Giants. Even though their military effectiveness was questionable, the king's obsession with these towering troops was so intense that he spent a small fortune, around 12 million thalers, on recruiting and maintaining them. That's a lot of cash for what essentially amounted to a royal basketball team. But back to young Fritz. He was everything his father despised: artistic, sensitive, and more interested in philosophy than in military drills. This didn't sit well with a dad who thought reading was something you did with a map. Frederick's love for music and French literature made his father's blood pressure rise faster than the crescendo in one of Bach's concertos. As if to add fuel to this fiery relationship, Frederick William once said of his son, "He is a mere effeminate creature who must be made into a man." Ouch! In an act of youthful rebellion, or perhaps sanity, Frederick hatched a plan to escape the iron grip of his father's authority. He plotted his getaway with his close friend and confidant, Hans Hermann von Katt. The plan was simple: flee to England. Simple, of course, if you overlook the fact that they were under constant surveillance, and that getting caught could mean very unpleasant things. Spoiler alert, they got caught. Now, the fallout from this botched escape was anything but mundane. Frederick was arrested and stripped of his rank, a humiliation that was the royal equivalent of being grounded for life. But the real tragedy was reserved for poor Katt. In a move that can only be described as medieval reality TV at its darkest, King Frederick William, I decided that Katt should be executed. And in a twist that would make even the harshest Game of Thrones episode seem like a bedtime story, Frederick was forced to watch his friend's execution. Talk about a formative experience. This traumatic event left an indelible mark on young Frederick. It taught him a few harsh lessons about power, authority, and the unpredictable nature of a father's wrath. The whole fiasco was a brutal reminder that in the world of 18th century royalty, personal ambitions were often crushed beneath the weight of political machinations and family expectations. Fast forward a bit, and we see how these early years shaped Frederick's views on power. When he eventually became king in 1740, he carried with him the scars of his youth. Frederick the Great didn't just emerge out of nowhere. He was forged in the fires of his father's tyrannical expectations and his own rebellious spirit. His rule was marked by a distinctive blend of military prowess and cultural patronage, a strange cocktail that was undoubtedly inspired by his own complicated past. Frederick's reign is often romanticized, with tales of his military brilliance and enlightened rule, but his early life serves as a reminder that these legends often come with a hefty dose of reality. The man who would go on to become one of Europe's most formidable rulers began his life battling not just external enemies, but also the very person who should have been his closest ally. And it was this battle that laid the groundwork for Frederick's complex legacy. As Frederick ascended to the throne in 1740, it was as if a new chapter had been written in the book of Prussian history, with Frederick himself as the pen-wielding author. And what did this fresh king decide to do with his newfound power? Well, for starters, he set out to revolutionize Prussia with a cocktail of reforms that mixed Enlightenment ideals with a healthy dose of realpolitik. This wasn't just a makeover. This was a full-on reinvention. Frederick's early reign was marked by a flurry of activity that would make even the busiest bee seem like a slacker. He was determined to drag Prussia kicking and screaming into the modern age, and he wasn't taking no for an answer. One of his first acts was to reform the judicial system, which was about as efficient as a snail in a marathon. Frederick's reforms streamlined the process, making it more accessible and, dare I say, fair. He introduced the general state laws for the Prussian states, a legal framework that was as ambitious as it was necessary. But it wasn't all about laws and order. Frederick had a soft spot for the arts, which is like having a pop of color in an otherwise monochrome world. He fancied himself a philosopher king, much in the vein of Plato's Republic, except with more powdered wigs and less toga. He established the Berlin Academy of Sciences and invited intellectual heavyweights like Voltaire to his court. This was Frederick's way of saying, hey, Prussia can do smart stuff too. Now, let's talk potatoes, a subject that is far more exciting than it sounds. You see, Frederick had an economic vision that included the humble spud. In a move that might be considered the 18th century equivalent of a viral marketing campaign, Frederick launched what some call the potato propaganda. Why potatoes, you ask? Well, in an era of frequent famines, potatoes were a reliable crop that could feed the masses. Frederick ordered the planting of potatoes and went so far as to personally promote their consumption. He even had soldiers guard potato fields to show their value, turning the tuber into a symbol of sustenance and state savvy. But not everything was rosy in the land of Frederick's reforms. His military ambitions were both a boon and a burden for Prussia. The man loved a good battlefield like a kid loves candy, and he wasn't shy about getting involved in a scrap. His first major conflict as king was the War of Austrian Succession. In 1740, he invaded Silesia, a region rich in resources and strategic value, like a teenager raiding the fridge. This bold move set off a chain of conflicts that would keep Europe on its toes for years to come. Frederick's military campaigns were a double-edged sword. On one hand, he expanded Prussian territory and bolstered his reputation as a military genius. On the other, the wars drained the state's coffers faster than you can say budget deficit. By the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, Prussia was nearly bankrupt, with Frederick juggling finances like a circus performer with one too many flaming torches. It was a classic case of biting off more than you can chew, but with cannons and cavalry. Amidst all this, the court of Frederick was a lively place, populated by a cast of characters as colorful as any you'd find in a Shakespearean comedy. There was Voltaire, the witty philosopher with a penchant for sarcasm that could slice through steel. Their friendship was a roller coaster of intellectual camaraderie and petty squabbles. Voltaire once quipped about Frederick's prose, "His Majesty's verses are like the peace of God. They pass all understanding." Ouch! Frederick's court was also home to musicians like Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who brought a touch of Baroque brilliance to the palace halls. Frederick himself was an accomplished flutist and composer, and he would often hold concerts where he could showcase his musical talents. It was like a royal version of America's Got Talent, minus the commercial breaks and celebrity judges. And then there were Frederick's personal quirks and peccadillos, which often seeped into state affairs. His penchant for wearing military uniforms, even when not on duty, was legendary. He once said, "A crown is merely a hat that lets the rain in." Yet, he wore his military garb with the kind of pride usually reserved for Olympic gold medals. His Spartan lifestyle was equally famous. Frederick preferred the company of his greyhounds to that of courtiers, and his meals were as simple as his wardrobe was grand. So, what do we make of Frederick the Great in these early years of his reign? Well, he's a bit of a paradox, isn't he? A man of war who cherished peace, a philosopher king who wielded a sword, and a reformer who sometimes broke as many things as he fixed. His legacy is as complex and multifaceted as the man himself, a blend of brilliance and blunders that would set the stage for all that was to follow. But don't pack up your powdered wigs just yet. There's much more to come in the saga of Frederick the Great. As we dive deeper into the saga of Frederick the Great, it's time to lace up those marching boots and get ready for a whirlwind tour of his most famous military campaigns. Frederick wasn't just a king who dabbled in music and philosophy. He was a monarch who knew that sometimes, to make an omelette, you've got to crack a few cannonballs. His military escapades were like an 18th century blockbuster, full of plot twists, dramatic battles, and more than a few budget overruns. Let's start with the War of Austrian Succession, a conflict that kicked off in 1740 when Frederick decided that Silesia, a gem of a region with its wealth of resources and strategic location, was too tempting to ignore. Like a kid with his eye on the last piece of candy in the jar, Frederick launched an invasion that would set Europe ablaze. Now, this wasn't just a spontaneous road trip. It was a meticulously planned campaign, albeit with a few detours along the way. Frederick's army, numbering about 27,000 men, moved with the precision of a Swiss watch, but the costs were astronomical. We're talking millions of thalers, a king's ransom in a world where budget spreadsheets were still a thing of the future. The War of Austrian Succession was a veritable chess match, with Frederick playing the role of a master strategist, or at least trying to. He was up against Maria Theresa of Austria, a formidable opponent who wasn't about to let her empire be sliced up like a birthday cake. Despite some initial successes, Frederick's luck was a mixed bag. His victories in battles like Marwitz in 1741 were sometimes less about military genius and more about being in the right place at the right time. Or, as Frederick himself might have put it, better lucky than good. The war dragged on for 8 years, a marathon of military maneuvers that saw Frederick's troops crisscrossing Europe like a particularly ambitious traveling circus. The distances covered were staggering, with armies marching hundreds of miles, often on foot, through mud and muck. Imagine the logistical nightmare of feeding and supplying thousands of men in an era before GPS and Amazon Prime. Yet, against the odds, Frederick emerged from the conflict with Silesia in his possession, a prize that bolstered his reputation and filled his coffers, at least temporarily. But if the War of Austrian Succession was the opening act, the 7 Years' War was the main event, a conflict so epic it makes Game of Thrones look like a neighborhood squabble. Beginning in 1756, this war saw Frederick facing off against a coalition of enemies that included Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden. It was as if the universe had conspired to give him the ultimate challenge, pitting him against nearly every major power in Europe. Frederick's strategy in the 7 Years' War was a high-wire act of epic proportions. He moved his armies with the agility of a chess grandmaster, fighting battles on multiple fronts and somehow managing to keep his adversaries guessing. One of his most famous victories came at the Battle of Rosbach in 1757, where his 22,000 troops faced off against a combined French and Austrian force more than twice their size. It was a classic David versus Goliath scenario, and Frederick played the role of David to perfection, delivering a resounding victory that sent shockwaves across Europe. Yet, for all his military prowess, Frederick's campaigns were also a testament to the capriciousness of war. His tactics were a blend of bold innovation and sheer audacity, but they were also accompanied by a healthy dose of luck. Take the Battle of Leuthen later that same year, a victory so decisive it cemented Frederick's status as a military legend. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find that his success was as much about exploiting enemy mistakes as it was about strategic brilliance. Of course, the costs of these campaigns were as monumental as the battles themselves. The 7 Years' War nearly bankrupted Prussia, leaving the state's finances in a shambles. Frederick became a master juggler of resources, borrowing heavily and imposing taxes that would make even the most seasoned IRS agent blush. By the war's end, in 1763, Prussia was teetering on the brink of financial ruin, with an economy that resembled a house of cards in a windstorm. So, what do we make of Frederick as a military leader? The myth paints him as a strategic genius, a commander whose very name inspired fear in the hearts of his enemies. But the reality is more nuanced. Yes, he was a brilliant tactician, but he was also a man who understood the value of propaganda, crafting a narrative that would endure long after the gunpowder had settled. Frederick's military campaigns are a study in contrasts, a blend of triumph and tribulation that offers a window into the complexities of power and ambition. He was a ruler who played the Game of Thrones with skill and cunning, but he was also a man who learned that victory often comes at a cost that defies calculation. As we continue to unravel the layers of Frederick's life, it's clear that his story is far from over. There's more to explore, more to question, and more to understand about this enigmatic king who left an indelible mark on history. So, stay tuned, because the saga of Frederick the Great is just getting started. As we delve into Frederick the Great's later years, it's as if we're peering into the mind of a man who was equal parts philosopher and politician. Picture a king who could toggle between discussing the finer points of metaphysics and orchestrating military maneuvers with the flick of a quill. Frederick's life was a tapestry woven with the threads of Enlightenment thought and realpolitik, a balancing act that would challenge even the most seasoned tightrope walker. Frederick's court was a veritable salon of Enlightenment thinkers, the intellectual glitterati of the 18th century, and at the heart of this cerebral hub was none other than Voltaire, the French philosopher whose wit was as sharp as a guillotine blade. Their friendship was one for the ages, full of intellectual banter, and let's face it, more drama than a reality TV reunion special. Voltaire arrived at Frederick's court in 1750, and it was as if two intellectual titans had finally found their perfect sparring partner. The two men exchanged letters with the fervor of modern-day texters, discussing everything from philosophy to governance. Frederick, who fancied himself an enlightened monarch, was eager to showcase his intellectual prowess. He even took to writing poetry, though Voltaire was less than impressed, famously quipping that Frederick's verses were like the peace of God, beyond human understanding. Ouch! Talk about a literary burn. But their friendship was more than just a series of intellectual jabs. It was a reflection of Frederick's commitment to the Enlightenment, an era that sought to replace the darkness of ignorance with the light of reason. Frederick's contributions to this movement were significant. He introduced reforms aimed at modernizing Prussia, such as promoting religious tolerance, albeit with a pinch of self-interest. After all, a diverse and content populace was less likely to revolt. Frederick was no fool. He knew that keeping the peace was sometimes as simple as letting people worship as they pleased. Yet, for all his enlightened ideals, Frederick was no stranger to the darker side of power. His political machinations were as ruthless as they were effective, a stark contrast to his love affair with philosophy. This was a king who could discourse on the virtues of liberty one moment and quash dissent with an iron fist the next. It's a bit like preaching about the joys of veganism while running a steakhouse on the side. Hypocritical, yet somehow cohesive in Frederick's complex world. Frederick's reign also saw the flourishing of the arts. He was a patron of music, not just as a distant admirer. Frederick himself was an accomplished flutist, composing over 100 sonatas and 4 symphonies. Imagine a king who could lead an army by day and compose a concerto by night. It was as if Frederick lived in two worlds, straddling the line between the battlefield and the concert hall. His court attracted musicians like Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who played second fiddle to none other than his illustrious father, Johann Sebastian Bach. Yet, for all the cultural glow, Frederick's reign was not without its shadows. His love for the arts did little to soften his political edges. Consider his annexation of Silesia, a move that was as strategic as it was controversial. The region's economic value, rich in resources and strategically located, was too tempting for Frederick to resist. It was a classic case of might makes right, with Frederick justifying his actions under the guise of political necessity. This duality, Frederick the artist and Frederick the autocrat, gets to the heart of his complex legacy. He was a ruler who could pen philosophical essays on human rights while simultaneously expanding his territories through military conquest. It's as if Machiavelli and Mozart had a love child, one who could debate the merits of a Bayesian theory while sketching battle plans on the back of a sonata. The friendship between Frederick and Voltaire eventually soured, a casualty of their clashing egos and differing philosophies. Their parting was as dramatic as their friendship had been vibrant, with Voltaire leaving Prussia in 1753 under a cloud of mutual recriminations. Yet, even in departure, their relationship remained a testament to the transformative power of ideas, a reflection of an era when intellectual discourse was as potent a force as any political alliance. Frederick's later years were marked by a continued devotion to the Enlightenment, albeit one tempered by the harsh realities of governance. His reforms in education and agriculture were ambitious, aiming to lift Prussia from the ashes of war. He established grain warehouses to prevent famine and encouraged agricultural innovation, including the cultivation of, you guessed it, potatoes. It was as if Frederick saw the humble tuber as a panacea for his kingdom's economic woes. He even issued decrees mandating their cultivation, proving that he was not above using a little royal strong-arming to achieve his ends. The king's commitment to public welfare was, however, not entirely altruistic. A well-fed populace was a stable one, and Frederick understood that a kingdom's strength lay not only in its armies, but in the prosperity of its people. It was a pragmatic approach to rule, one that acknowledged the interdependence of power and productivity. Yet Frederick's reign was not without its contradictions. His military campaigns, while expanding Prussian influence, left a trail of destruction in their wake. The costs, both human and financial, were staggering, a reminder that glory often carries a heavy toll. Frederick's legacy, much like the man himself, is a tapestry of contradictions. He was a king who dreamed of peace, yet spent much of his reign at war, a ruler who championed enlightenment while wielding power with a firm hand. As we continue to explore the life of Frederick the Great, it's clear that his story is far from a simple tale of conquest and culture. It's a narrative rich with complexity, a saga of a monarch who straddled the worlds of art and arms with equal dexterity. Frederick's later years offer a window into the mind of a ruler who was as much a product of his time as he was a shaper of it, an enduring figure whose legacy continues to captivate and confound in equal measure. So buckle up, because the journey through Frederick's world is far from over, and there's plenty more to uncover in the chapters ahead. So, as we zero in on the enigma of Frederick the Great, let's peel back the layers of myth and reality like an 18th century onion, minus the tears, but with a side of historical insight. You see, Frederick's legacy is a bit like that mysterious old painting in your grandma's attic. Fascinating, a little dusty, and open to interpretation. Known affectionately as Old Fritz by the end of his reign, Frederick left a mark on Prussian and European history that's both striking and smudged with contradictions. First off, the romanticized image of Frederick as the quintessential enlightened despot deserves a reality check. Sure, he was a patron of the arts, a lover of philosophy, and a writer of more mediocre poetry than he probably should have admitted. But let's not forget the man behind the myth, a ruler who maintained a vice-like grip on power and wasn't above using a bayonet to make a point. His version of enlightened often meant my way or the highway, with a dash of enlightened absolutism thrown in for good measure. Frederick's economic and social reforms were significant, yet they were often driven by necessity rather than sheer benevolence. Consider his promotion of the potato, which was less about culinary innovation and more about staving off famine in a country still reeling from the costs of war. It was practical, sure, but it was also pragmatic in the way that only a ruler staring down the barrel of a starving populace can be. His reforms in agriculture and industry were designed to rebuild a war-torn economy, and while they contributed to Prussia's eventual prosperity, they were also a band-aid on a bullet wound, a quick fix that masked deeper issues of economic disparity. Politically, Frederick's impact on future generations was nothing short of seismic. He transformed Prussia into a great power, setting the stage for the unification of Germany in the 19th century. But achieving this status came at a steep price. His military campaigns, while tactically brilliant, drained the kingdom's resources, not to mention its people. By the end of his reign, Prussia was a formidable military machine, but it was also a nation exhausted by decades of near-constant warfare. It's like winning a marathon only to realize you've left your shoes, and maybe a few toes, behind. Frederick's legacy is also marked by his complex relationship with religion. He championed religious tolerance, allowing Catholics, Protestants, and Jews to practice their faiths freely. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't solely out of the goodness of his heart. A diverse, content population was a stable one, and Frederick was nothing if not a pragmatist. His religious policies were as much about political stability as they were about personal belief, a fact that often gets glossed over in the romanticized tales of Old Fritz, the benevolent king. And then there were his failures, which are often overshadowed by his successes in the annals of history. His inability to produce an heir left Prussia's future uncertain, a ticking time bomb that would only be diffused by the eventual ascension of his nephew. His centralized control, while effective for a time, sowed the seeds of bureaucratic inefficiency that would plague Prussia long after his reign. It's a bit like building a castle on a foundation of sand, impressive to look at, but prone to crumbling under pressure. Despite these shortcomings, Frederick's influence on military strategy and statecraft is undeniable. His innovative tactics and emphasis on a disciplined, professional army set a standard that will be emulated by generals and militaries across Europe. Yet, it's worth noting that his military genius was often as much a product of his opponent's blunders as his own brilliance. Frederick was a master of exploiting weakness, a trait that served him well in battles, but perhaps less so in matters of state. So, how do we reconcile the legend of Frederick the Great with the historical reality? The answer lies in embracing the complexity of his character. Frederick was a man of contradictions, a a soldier who cherished peace, a philosopher who wielded power, and a king who balanced the scales of enlightenment and autocracy. His legacy is a testament to the multifaceted nature of leadership, a reminder that great figures in history are rarely as one-dimensional as the statues erected in their honor. In the end, Frederick the Great remains one of those historical figures who defy easy categorization. His achievements are monumental, his failures instructive, and his life a tapestry woven with threads of both light and shadow. As we close the book on Frederick's story, let's remember that history, much like human nature, is rarely black and white. It's a kaleidoscope of experiences and influences, each contributing to the narrative in ways that are both profound and perplexing. So, as you tuck this tale of Frederick the Great into your mental library, remember to keep a critical eye on the legends and a curious mind on the truths that lie beneath. History is not just a collection of dates and events. It's a dialogue between the past and the present, a conversation that invites us to question, to learn, and, most importantly, to understand. As for Frederick, well, perhaps he'd like to be remembered not just as the Great, but as a man who dared to dream big even when reality had other plans. You wake up to the muffled clamor of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire's crown jewel, and it's not the subtle morning chirp of birds, but the robust racket of a city that never seems to sleep. The 10th century isn't about hitting snooze, it's about hitting the ground running. You're greeted by the cacophony of merchants setting up shop, their voices weaving a tapestry of urgency and opportunity. These vendors are the original 24/7 service, but forget about customer reviews. Here, it's all about haggling like your life depends on it. Start your day by navigating the narrow, winding streets, which, let's face it, are less about urban planning and more about organized chaos. Constantinople is a bustling metropolis, or as close as you get in this era. The city is a tinderbox of activity, with a population that's rumored to be over 500,000, though good luck finding a census taker brave enough to count. You can thank the strategic genius of the Theodosian walls for keeping this hive of humanity safe from the not-so-neighborly neighbors. Built in the 5th century, these walls stretch about 5 kilometers and are the architectural equivalent of a "Do Not Disturb" sign to invading forces. They're a triple-layered fortress of stone and determination, with a moat thrown in for good measure. Forget about breaching them unless you've got a plan more elaborate than a Byzantine court intrigue. The streets are alive with the scent of spices that have traveled further than most people. Silk, pepper, and cinnamon make their way here from as far as China and India, while the local bakers tempt you with honey-drenched pastries that are the caloric equivalent of a bear hug. You're in the original melting pot of cultures, a place where East meets West, and they both decide to stick around for the baklava. As you walk, the chatter of languages, Greek, Latin, and a smattering of others, fills the air, a testament to the city's role as a commercial hub. Your belly might rumble, but your soul seeks something more than sustenance. The Byzantines are big on religion. It's the social glue that keeps this sprawling empire from unraveling at the seams. You head towards one of the city's many churches, where morning prayer is as much a part of daily routine as breakfast. The Hagia Sophia, the crown jewel of them all, stands as a monument to Byzantine ambition. Built in just under 6 years in the 6th century, its dome seems to defy gravity, much like the empire itself. Some say it's a testament to divine favor, others whisper about structural wizardry. Either way, it's a sight to behold. You're not just here for spiritual enlightenment, though. The church is also where you catch up on the latest gossip. It's basically the water cooler of the ancient world. Here, you learn about Emperor Constantine Roman VII, the scholar on the throne, who's more into books than battles. His reign is a period of relative peace and cultural renaissance, which, let's be honest, is a nice change of pace from the usual cycle of conquest and chaos. After getting your fill of both sacred and secular news, it's time to dive into the markets. The Forum of Constantine is your next stop, a bustling plaza where the price of olive oil sparks debates more heated than any philosophical treatise. The Forum is an open-air theater of commerce, with everything from textiles to trinkets vying for your attention. Haggle if you dare, for these merchants are seasoned gladiators in the arena of trade. You notice the clinking of coins, and yes, that's actual gold and silver you hear. The Byzantine solidus, a gold coin weighing about 5 grams, is the currency of choice. It's the economic lifeline that keeps trade routes buzzing and empires afloat. But don't be fooled by its glint. It's not all prosperity and peace. Inflation is a constant threat, and the empire's coffers are always in need of a refill, thanks to costly wars and grandiose projects. By now, you're aware that life in Constantinople is a balancing act, much like walking the city's hilly terrain in sandals that were never meant for cardio. As noon approaches, the sun climbs higher, casting long shadows that stretch across the mosaic-like streets. You find yourself contemplating the empire's peculiar blend of opulence and austerity. The Byzantine Empire, like its capital, is a paradox wrapped in a mystery, seasoned with a dash of imperial flair. But it's not time to rest yet. The day is only half done. You've got more to see, more to learn, and certainly more to ponder. As you weave through the throngs of people, you realize that every corner of this city tells a story, every stone holds a secret. So keep your eyes open and your wits about you. After all, in Constantinople, history is happening right under your feet. As the sun continues its ascent, casting a golden hue over Constantinople, you're not just wandering through streets anymore. You're tiptoeing through the Byzantine bureaucracy, a web so tangled even a spider would be envious. Picture an office space where the hierarchy is more convoluted than a Shakespearean plot, and you've got the Byzantine government. It's a place where titles matter more than coffee, and let me tell you, that's saying something. The Byzantine Empire, you see, isn't just about emperors and generals. Oh no, it's a smorgasbord of officials, eunuchs, and assorted dignitaries with titles that sound like they were generated by a medieval version of a fantasy name generator. We're talking about positions like the protovisharios or the megas domesticos, which, if you're wondering, aren't characters from a Harry Potter book, but real roles in this labyrinthine administration. Why so many titles, you ask? Well, in a society that thrived on complex hierarchies, titles were as important as oxygen. They indicated your standing, your power, and most crucially, your potential for social mobility. It's like climbing a corporate ladder, except the ladder is made of slippery Byzantine marble, and it's constantly under renovation. In this world, even a farmer could, in theory, rise to the echelons of power. The catch, theoretical doesn't always translate to practical. But let's not kill the dream just yet. Speaking of dreams, let's talk about the infamous Byzantine theme system. No, not a new restaurant concept, but a military and administrative structure that divided the empire into regions called themes. It was a nifty piece of governance that worked like clockwork, or at least like a clock that occasionally needed a good whack to get going again. These themes were not just about drawing lines on a map. They were the backbone of Byzantine stability, each with its own army and governor. Imagine a federal system where each state has its own militia, but the uniforms are way more fabulous. The theme system was the empire's answer to managing its sprawling territories without constantly having to play the ancient equivalent of whack-a-mole with rebellious provinces. Now, let's bust a myth that's more persistent than a Byzantine tax collector. The notion of the decadent Byzantine aristocracy lounging around in silks and sipping wine all day. It's about as accurate as expecting to find a vegan at a Texas BBQ. Sure, there were moments of opulence, but the reality was far grimmer. The aristocracy was a working class in its own right, tasked with administering lands, collecting taxes, and maintaining order. They were more likely to be found with ink-stained fingers than with a goblet of wine. The real wine enthusiasts, probably the local tavern keepers, who knew that liquid currency was just as profitable as the solidus. And speaking of currency, let's not forget the economic tightrope that is Byzantine finance. The empire's economy was a delicate balance of trade, taxation, and the occasional bout of inflation that could make a Roman denarius look like a penny. The challenge was keeping the coffers full without squeezing the populace dry, a task that would make even the most seasoned accountant break into a cold sweat. The Byzantine rulers had to be part economist, part magician, pulling fiscal rabbits out of hats when times got tough. But back to the bureaucracy, because who doesn't love a good bureaucratic tale? The real power players in this world were often the eunuchs, those enigmatic figures who wielded influence behind the scenes like puppet masters in silk robes. Why eunuchs, you ask? Well, in a world where alliances were as fickle as the weather, eunuchs were seen as loyal, without the pesky problem of producing heirs to challenge imperial authority. They were the trusted advisors, the secret keepers, the ones who could navigate the imperial court like a chess grandmaster on speed. As you walk through the city, you realize that the Byzantine Empire is a study in contrasts, a place where titles can make or break you, where the military is both a tool and a threat, and where the glamour of power is often overshadowed by the grit of governance. It's a world where the line between legend and reality is as thin as a Byzantine gold leaf, and just as prone to tarnish. By now, the sun is high, casting sharp shadows that mirror the empire's own dualities. You've delved into the socio-political tapestry of Byzantine life, and yet there's still so much more to uncover. As you navigate the bustling streets, each step is a reminder that in this empire, history isn't just a story, it's an ongoing saga, with twists and turns that would make even the most seasoned storyteller pause in admiration. So, keep your eyes peeled and your mind sharp. The Byzantine Empire is a place where every stone has a story, every shadow a secret, and every title a tale of ambition and intrigue. And remember, you're not just learning about history, you're walking in its footsteps, feeling its pulse, and engaging with its complexities. Stay tuned, because the Byzantine narrative is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be just as captivating. As you continue your journey through the bustling heart of Constantinople, it becomes clear that this city is more than just a backdrop for imperial drama. It's a living, breathing testament to Byzantine culture's kaleidoscopic nature. The streets pulse with the echoes of Greek, Roman, and Christian influences, a fusion that defines the empire's ethos as much as the towering Theodosian walls define its skyline. Let's dive headfirst into the educational system, because, surprise, surprise, the Byzantines were bookworms. They took the ancient Greek love for philosophy and rhetoric, doused it in Roman practicality, and sprinkled a generous helping of Christian theology on top. If you were a young scholar with dreams of intellectual grandeur, you'd find yourself reciting Homer before breakfast and debating Aristotelian ethics by lunchtime. This rigorous education system wasn't just about churning out scholars like Michael Sellos, who, by the way, was kind of a big deal with his philosophical musings and political treatises. It was about crafting the very soul of Byzantium. The Byzantine academic scene was more competitive than a reality TV show, and if you wanted to stand out, you needed more than just a sharp mind. You needed connections, charisma, and perhaps a bit of luck. The curriculum was a blend of the trivium and quadrivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Picture it as a liberal arts education on steroids, with a side of theological debate that could make your head spin faster than an antique globe. But not everything was scholarly pursuits and intellectual banter. The Hippodrome, Constantinople's answer to the Roman Colosseum, was where the empire's pulse truly quickened. This wasn't just an arena for chariot races. It was the beating heart of Byzantine public life. Imagine a stadium that could hold up to 100,000 spectators, cheering with a fervor that would make a modern sports crowd look like a polite golf audience. The factions, blues and greens, weren't just teams. They were political entities, social clubs, and sometimes riotous mobs. Think of them as the original superfans. Only their loyalty could sway imperial policy or topple a ruler. No pressure, right? The Hippodrome was also a political stage where emperors like Justinian could either solidify their power or watch it unravel before their eyes. The Nika riots of 532 AD, which started as a chariot race dispute, escalated into a full-blown rebellion that nearly razed the city. The stakes were higher than a Game of Thrones finale, and the cost of losing could be catastrophic. Justinian, ever the wily strategist, quelled the uprising with a mix of brute force and political cunning, leaving thousands dead but his throne intact. The Hippodrome was a microcosm of Byzantine society, where the line between entertainment and political machination was as thin as a charioteer's whip. Now, let's tackle the elephant in the room, or rather, the icons. The iconoclast controversy wasn't just a theological spat. It was a seismic event that shook the very foundations of Byzantine society. Picture a world where the veneration of religious images was hotly debated, with one side seeing them as essential to worship, while the other viewed them as idolatrous trappings. This wasn't just a matter of faith. It was about power, control, and the very identity of Byzantium. The first wave of iconoclasm hit in 726 AD, when Emperor Leo Roman III decided that icons were out of vogue and ordered their removal. The empire was split down the middle, with iconophiles, those pro-icon, and iconoclasts, those anti-icon, clashing like philosophical titans. The controversy raged for over a century, with emperors and empresses flipping sides like a Byzantine coin caught midair. It wasn't until 843 AD, during the reign of Empress Theodora, that icons made their triumphant return, marking the end of the iconoclast period. But why did this matter so much? Simply put, icons were more than religious symbols. They were political tools. They adorned churches, homes, and imperial regalia, and their removal or restoration could signal a shift in imperial policy or theological doctrine. Controversy left scars that shaped Byzantine art, theology, and politics for generations. It was a reminder that in Byzantium, the divine and the earthly were inextricably linked, each influencing the other in a dance as intricate as the mosaics that decorated their churches. Byzantine art, in the wake of this controversy, evolved into a distinct style, combining the grandeur of Roman monumental art with the spiritual intensity of the early Christian tradition. Icons became windows to the divine, their stylized, otherworldly figures designed to inspire awe and devotion. This art form, despite its turbulent history, became one of Byzantium's most enduring legacies, influencing the Orthodox world and beyond. As you stroll through the city, you find that the Byzantine Empire is like a complex mosaic, each piece, education, entertainment, religion, interlocking to create a picture that is as beautiful as it is bewildering. The empire's greatness lay not just in its military conquests or its architectural marvels, but in its ability to absorb, adapt, and innovate. It was a civilization that thrived on contradiction, where the sacred and the secular, the Greek and the Roman, the old and the new, all coexisted in a delicate balance. Yet, the story of Byzantium is far from over. As you reach the midpoint of your journey, you realize that each step forward is a step deeper into a world that is at once familiar and foreign. The Byzantine Empire, with its rich tapestry of culture, politics, and religion, continues to unfold, revealing layers of complexity that defy easy categorization. So, take a deep breath, because the Byzantine narrative is a marathon, not a sprint, and there's still much more to discover. And speaking of marathons, let's switch gears from intellectual sprints and theological debates to the Byzantine economy. A beast so complex, it makes modern-day stock markets look like a lemonade stand. As the afternoon sun begins its descent over Constantinople, casting an ever-so-flattering golden glow on its bustling streets, you find yourself pondering the empire's economic engine. What keeps this sprawling metropolis ticking like a well-oiled, albeit ancient, machine? First up, let's talk about the gold solidus, the rock star of Byzantine currency. Minted under Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, this coin wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a statement. Weighing in at a tidy 5 grams of pure gold, the solidus was the backbone of Byzantine commerce, as reliable as a Roman aqueduct and nearly as indestructible. Its value was so stable that it became the standard currency for international trade, welcomed across Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of Asia like a long-lost friend. Now, while the solidus glittered with the promise of prosperity, the Byzantine economy was far from a static affair. Picture a complex network of trade routes stretching from the sunny shores of Spain to the bustling bazaars of Baghdad, all converging in the empire's beating heart. Constantinople was the ultimate marketplace, a vibrant kaleidoscope of goods and cultures that made your local shopping mall look like a mom-and-pop store. But wait, there's a twist in the tale. Silk, the fabric of emperors and fashionistas alike. In 553 AD, Byzantine monks, playing the role of medieval James Barnes, smuggled silkworm eggs and mulberry leaves out of China. That's right. Espionage wasn't just for Cold War thrillers. This daring act of silk sabotage transformed Byzantium into a major player in the silk trade, and soon the empire was spinning its own luxurious threads. Silk production became a state secret tighter than a Byzantine vault, guarded as fiercely as the emperor's own crown jewels. So why all the cloak and dagger for a bit of fancy fabric? Simple. Control the silk, control the wealth. Silk wasn't just a luxury, it was a currency, a diplomatic tool, and a symbol of imperial power. The empire's silk industry became a tightly regulated monopoly, with workshops scattered across the empire, each one a cog in the Byzantine economic machine. Despite the romantic allure of silk and gold, the Byzantine economy was no fairy tale. It was a delicate dance of supply and demand, taxation and trade, innovation and adaptation. Take the monastic communities, for instance. Far from being secluded spiritual retreats, these monasteries were economic powerhouses. Imagine sprawling estates that not only offered salvation, but also employed thousands in agriculture, textile production, and even metallurgy. Monks weren't just men of faith. They were industrious landlords with a knack for balancing prayer with profit. Here's where we debunk the myth of a static Byzantine economy, a narrative as appealing as a bedtime story, but just as fictitious. The empire wasn't stuck in the past. It was a living, breathing organism, constantly evolving to meet the challenges of its time. When Arab conquests disrupted traditional trade routes in the 7th century, Byzantium didn't fold like a flimsy tent. Instead, it pivoted, forging new alliances and diversifying its economic activities. Maritime trade flourished, and Byzantine ships became a familiar sight from the Black Sea to the Aegean. But let's not gloss over the darker side of this economic tapestry. Inflation was the ever-present specter haunting Byzantine dreams. When emperors decided to debase the currency to fund wars or lavish projects, the solidus could suddenly lose its luster. Prices soared, and the common folk bore the brunt, their lives as precarious as a charioteer on a slippery track. Yet, through it all, the Byzantine economy displayed a resilience that would make any modern economist tip their hat in admiration. By now, the sun is dipping lower, casting long shadows over Constantinople's stone facades. You've traversed the intricate web of Byzantine commerce, uncovering the secrets of silk and the steadfastness of the solidus. The economy wasn't just a backdrop, it was a driving force, shaping the empire's fortunes and misfortunes alike. As you stroll through the fading light, the city hums with the energy of 1,000 stories yet to be told. Byzantium is a place where the past and present coexist in a delicate harmony, where every coin and every trade is a thread in the vast, intricate tapestry of history. And just like that, the Byzantine narrative continues to unfold, its chapters as varied and vibrant as the empire itself. Stay tuned, for there's still more to explore in this captivating saga, and the next part promises to be as enlightening as the last. As evening casts its gentle shadow over the bustling streets of Constantinople, let's take a moment to ponder the indelible legacy of the Byzantine Empire. This isn't just a stroll down memory lane. It's a deep dive into the echoes of a civilization that has left its fingerprints all over modern governance, art, and religion. The Byzantine Empire, with its dazzling mosaics and intricate bureaucracy, was more than just a historical footnote. It was the original influencer, long before Instagram was even a glimmer in the digital eye. First, let's talk governance. The Byzantines didn't just hand us a blueprint for complicated titles and court intrigue. They were the architects of a centralized state that balanced power like a tightrope walker on a windy day. Their system of governance was a marvel of administrative acrobatics, with the emperor sitting at the head of a complex web of civil servants and military commanders, all held together by a Byzantine version of duct tape, faith, tradition, and a smattering of gold coins. It's a model that inspired later European monarchies, and dare I say, even modern bureaucracies. So the next time you're caught in red tape, remember, you can blame Byzantium. But governance wasn't the only thing the Byzantines excelled in. They were also the maestros of art, crafting a visual language that still resonates today. Byzantine art, with its shimmering gold backgrounds and ethereal icons, became the visual soundtrack of orthodoxy, a style that permeated Eastern Europe and Russia. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were theological statements, each stroke of the brush or tesserae of a mosaic telling a story of divine presence and imperial power. It's an art form that, much like a catchy tune, refuses to fade away, influencing everything from Renaissance paintings to kitschy Orthodox calendars. Religion, too, bears the Byzantine stamp. The Great Schism of 1054, which split Christianity into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic branches, was a seismic event that shaped religious landscapes. The Byzantines weren't just passive players in this drama. They were active participants, debating theology with the fervor of a Twitter flame war. Their legacy, a religious tradition rich in ritual and mysticism, one that continues to shape the spiritual lives of millions. So, if you've ever marveled at the incense-laden rites of an Orthodox service, tip your hat to Byzantium. They wrote the manual. Now, let's tackle the elephant in the room, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. How did an empire renowned for its resilience and ingenuity succumb to the Ottoman onslaught? The answer is a cocktail of economic strain, military miscalculations, and let's face it, a dash of bad luck. The Byzantine economy, once the envy of the world, was a shadow of its former self, drained by constant warfare and shaky alliances. The Ottomans, on the other hand, were the new kids on the block, armed with gunpowder and ambition, two ingredients that proved lethal to the ancient walls of Constantinople. But the fall wasn't just a military defeat, it was a cultural watershed. With the city's conquest, a flood of Greek scholars fled west, taking their knowledge and manuscripts with them. This intellectual migration fueled the Renaissance, sparking a rebirth of classical learning in Europe. So, in a twist of historical irony, the fall of Byzantium helped light the fires of Western Enlightenment. It's a reminder that even in defeat, there can be an unexpected legacy, a lesson in resilience that transcends time. Yet, when we look back on Byzantium, it's easy to fall into the trap of romanticizing its gilded icons and imperial grandeur, while glossing over the harsher realities. The empire was a paradox, a place where opulence and austerity coexisted, where faith was both a unifying force and a divisive weapon. It's a narrative that continues to captivate the imagination, a story that feels as relevant today as it did centuries ago. In modern culture, Byzantium has been both idolized and misrepresented, its history often reduced to a series of cliches and stereotypes. We picture emperors lounging in luxury, oblivious to the world crumbling around them, yet the truth is far more nuanced. Byzantine rulers were often savvy strategists, balancing external threats with internal strife, a task that would challenge even the most seasoned of leaders. The real story of Byzantium is one of human endeavor, of triumphs and failures, of a civilization that, despite its eventual fall, left a legacy as enduring as the city's legendary walls. So, as the stars twinkle over the Bosporus, casting their ancient light on a city that once ruled the world, we're left with a deeper understanding of Byzantium, a civilization that was as complex as the mosaics it created, as resilient as the walls that defended it, and as influential as the ideas it propagated. The Byzantine Empire may have fallen, but its echoes continue to resonate, a testament to a time when faith and power danced a delicate waltz across the stage of history. And as we close this chapter, remember, history isn't just about what was, it's about what's to come, a reminder that the past is always present, shaping our world in ways both seen and unseen. In the bustling streets of Pisa, circa 1580, a young Galileo Galilei was more interested in the mechanics of the cathedral's swinging lamps than the prayers being said inside. While most teenagers might have been content to nap through Mass, Galileo was captivated by the way those lamps swung back and forth, seemingly defying the passage of time itself. This wasn't just idle curiosity. Little did he know, this curiosity would eventually pendulum into the foundations of modern physics. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is a man who once openly defied Aristotle by turning the Leaning Tower of Pisa into his personal physics laboratory. Galileo was born in 1564, a year that's easy to remember because it's the same year Shakespeare was born. While Shakespeare was busy inventing words like eyeball and swagger, Galileo was growing up in a world that still believed the Earth was the center of the universe. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician and a mathematician, which might explain Galileo's flair for harmonizing numbers with natural phenomena. But Vincenzo wasn't just plucking strings and adding sums. He was a bit of a rebel himself, questioning the established doctrines of music and encouraging his son to do the same with science. When Galileo enrolled at the University of Pisa in 1581, he was supposed to study medicine. After all, medical doctors had a shot at fame and fortune, while scientists were the rock stars of absolutely nobody. But Galileo had different plans. His heart wasn't in diagnosing diseases, it was in dissecting the mysteries of the universe. The only problem: Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, had some pretty strong opinions on how the universe worked, and those opinions had been treated as gospel truth for nearly 2,000 years. Galileo, however, wasn't buying it. The young man had a knack for questioning authority, a trait that didn't exactly endear him to his professors. Take, for example, the time he challenged Aristotle's theory of gravity. According to Aristotle, heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones. It made sense on paper, right? But Galileo wasn't satisfied with paper logic. So he did what any rebellious student would do. He took his experiment to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Legend has it, though some historians debate its accuracy, that Galileo climbed the tower, armed with 2 spheres of different weights, and dropped them both to the ground. The result: they hit the dirt at the same time. Physics: 1, Aristotle, 0. Whether or not this experiment actually took place as described, Galileo's calculations and observations certainly did. He demonstrated, through rigorous experimentation, that the speed of a falling object is independent of its mass. This was a big deal. Like, you just disproved a 2-millennium-old theory level of big. But before we set off fireworks in his honor, it's crucial to remember that challenging established norms wasn't exactly a surefire ticket to success back then. In fact, it was more like a surefire way to become the enemy of the academic establishment. Galileo's early defiance set the stage for a career characterized by bold ideas and even bolder clashes with authority. And this was just the beginning. The university, unimpressed by his antics, wasn't exactly handing out accolades, but Galileo's mind was already set on a course that would challenge the very pillars of ancient knowledge. Think of him as the scientific equivalent of a punk rock star, smashing preconceptions with the same fervor one might smash a guitar. In the late 16th century, Pisa wasn't just famous for its Leaning Tower. It was a hub of commerce and a center of learning, but it was also a place where tradition reigned supreme. Galileo's penchant for questioning everything from the motion of the stars to the motion of falling bodies put him at odds with the status quo. It wasn't just his scientific inquiries that made waves. His personality, sharp as a tack and just as pointed, often rubbed people the wrong way. You might say Galileo didn't just drop spheres, he dropped truth bombs. Nevertheless, Galileo's time in Pisa wasn't all about defying Aristotle. He was also honing his skills in mathematics. Mathematics, as it turned out, was the true language of the universe, a fact Galileo would come to champion throughout his life. During his university years, he developed a keen interest in the work of Archimedes, the ancient mathematician and physicist, and this would shape his approach to scientific inquiry. Galileo wasn't just asking questions, he was finding ways to answer them. By the time he left the University of Pisa in 1585, Galileo was armed with a plethora of ideas and a determination to challenge the old guard. He didn't have a degree, thanks to his habitual clashes with the university's rigid curriculum, but he had something arguably more valuable, an unyielding spirit of curiosity. And so, with his mind ablaze with questions and his pockets conspicuously light, Galileo set out into a world that was about to be turned upside down by his discoveries. It's crucial to understand that Galileo's early years in Pisa were more than just a prelude to his later accomplishments. They were the crucible in which his rebellious spirit and scientific acumen were forged. Here was a man who wasn't content with the answers of the past. He was determined to ask the questions of the future. His time in Pisa was a testament to the power of inquiry and the importance of challenging established norms, even when such challenges meant standing alone against centuries of tradition. Sure, dropping spheres off a tower might seem like a stunt fit for a YouTube channel today, but in Galileo's time, it was an act of scientific rebellion, a declaration of independence from ancient dogma. And while the myth of the Leaning Tower experiment might have been romanticized over time, it perfectly encapsulates the spirit of Galileo's early years. Bold, daring, and unafraid to fall flat in the pursuit of truth. As we continue to explore his life, keep in mind that Galileo wasn't just a scientist. He was a revolutionary, one who would go on to redefine our understanding of the cosmos. But for now, let's leave him standing at the base of the Leaning Tower, looking up, not just at the spheres he dropped, but at the limitless sky above. a sky he was determined to understand. As the echoes of those fateful spheres hitting the ground reverberated in Galileo's mind, he found himself at a crossroads. Pisa had been a proving ground, but there was a whole universe, both literal and metaphorical, waiting to be explored. Fast forward a few years, and we find Galileo in Padua, a city known more for its intellectual ferment than its leaning architecture. This was 1592, and Padua was home to one of the most prestigious universities in Europe. It was here that Galileo's reputation as a teacher and inventor really took off, like a cannonball from one of his beloved catapults. Padua, with its cobblestone streets and buzzing academic atmosphere, was a place where ideas were currency, though, as Galileo soon learned, they didn't exactly pay the rent. He was hired by the University of Padua to teach mathematics, which in those days was considered somewhere between alchemy and accounting in terms of prestige. His salary, a modest 180 florins a year, which, let's be honest, was barely enough to keep him in quills and ink, let alone the finer things he fancied. But Galileo wasn't just about teaching equations to bored students. Oh no, our guy was busy tinkering away, turning his ideas into tangible tools. Enter the military compass, or as it was known in the trade, the sector. This wasn't your average classroom geometry tool. It was a multifunctional wonder, capable of handling everything from surveying land to calculating artillery trajectories. In a time when warfare was practically a seasonal sport, you can imagine how valuable such an invention was. The military compass was a hit among generals and engineers alike, and for a while it seemed like Galileo had struck gold. Yet, despite the success of his invention, financial woes loomed like a particularly stubborn rain cloud. You see, Galileo had a penchant for the good life. He wasn't living like a monk, that's for sure. His tastes ran towards fine wine, elegant clothes, and the occasional extravagant dinner party. The kind of lifestyle that makes a 180 florin salary look like pocket change. And so, the mathematics prodigy found himself in a bit of a fiscal pickle. To make ends meet, Galileo began offering private lessons in the use of his military compass. He charged 120 florins a pop, a small fortune at the time, and a testament to the compass's perceived value. But even this wasn't enough to curb his financial misadventures. The reality was that being a scientist in the early 1600 wasn't exactly the ticket to a life of luxury. More often than not, it was a ticket to financial anxiety and late-night number-crunching sessions, not the kind of math he enjoyed. Galileo's financial predicament was emblematic of the broader economic landscape. The late 16th and early 17th centuries were times of transition. Europe was experiencing the tail end of the Renaissance, but it was also grappling with the economic aftershocks of events like the Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, and for intellectuals, especially those like Galileo, who preferred questioning to conforming, economic stability was as elusive as a clear night sky in Venice. This brings us to one of the great ironies of Galileo's life. Here was a man who could map the heavens and measure the earth, yet his own household budget was something of a black hole. It's a reminder that genius isn't always accompanied by financial savvy. It's a tale as old as time. The brilliant mind who can unravel the mysteries of the universe but can't quite figure out how to keep the lights on. In Padua, Galileo also developed his skills as a teacher. His lectures were legendary, attracting students from far and wide. He had a flair for drama, often using practical demonstrations to illustrate complex points. Imagine a lecture where, instead of droning on about the laws of motion, the professor suddenly whips out a projectile and launches it across the room to make his point. That was Galileo, part scientist, part showman, and entirely captivating. Yet despite his talents and inventions, Galileo's financial struggles persisted. His friends, recognizing his genius, often stepped in to help. They provided loans, gifts, and occasionally a shoulder to cry on. But it was a precarious existence, one that highlighted the harsh reality of being an innovator in an era that hadn't quite figured out how to reward innovation. And so, Galileo's middle years were a study in contrasts. On the one hand, he was making groundbreaking contributions to science and technology. On the other, he was navigating the choppy waters of economic hardship, his dreams occasionally weighed down by the harsh realities of daily life. It's a tale that resonates even today, reminding us that the path of the pioneer is often fraught with challenges. As we leave Galileo tinkering in his workshop, his mind a whirl of ideas and his pockets a bit lighter than he'd like, it's clear that his story is far from over. He's on the cusp of discoveries that will forever change our understanding of the cosmos. But for now, let's pause and appreciate the man behind the myth, a man whose genius was matched only by his humanity, whose struggles were as real as his triumphs. And as the sun sets over Padua, casting long shadows over the ancient city, we can be sure that Galileo, ever the dreamer, is already looking to the stars. As Galileo stood in Padua, his gaze set on the celestial heights, little did anyone guess that he was about to completely flip our understanding of the universe on its head. You might say the stars were aligning for him, literally. Galileo was about to take a small, seemingly innocuous Dutch invention and turn it into a tool that would not only open the heavens, but also open up a world of trouble. Cue the telescope, the gadget that would transform Galileo from a struggling teacher into an astronomical icon. Now, let's talk telescopes for a second. In 1609, these devices were the new kids on the block, the kind of novelty you'd find in the gift shop of a Dutch carnival. They weren't the precision instruments we know today. Think more along the lines of a pirate's spyglass. But Galileo, never one to shy away from a good tinker, got wind of this Dutch invention and decided to make it his own. He improved the design, boosting the magnification from a basic 3x to a whopping 20x. With this, the man practically invented the astronomical telescope as we know it. Armed with his new superscope, Galileo turned his gaze skyward. What he saw was nothing short of revolutionary. In January 1610, he discovered 4 objects orbiting Jupiter, moons like our own, but circling another planet. This was a big deal, folks, because up until then, everything in the universe was thought to revolve around the Earth. Here was the celestial equivalent of moving the goalposts, and boy, did it kick up a storm. These 4 moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, weren't just heavenly bodies, they were game-changers. Galileo named them the Medicean stars, a nod to the powerful Medici family, his patrons. A smart move, considering that keeping powerful friends close was a matter of survival as much as success. And speaking of patrons, let's bust a myth right here. Galileo wasn't some isolated genius working away in a lonely tower. Nope, he was as much a product of his networks as of his intellect. The Medici family, one of the richest and most influential families in all of Europe, provided the kind of financial and social support that was absolutely crucial. Their backing not only lent credibility to his work, but also provided a shield against the inevitable backlash from the academic and religious establishments. Galileo's ability to navigate the political landscape was as critical to his success as his scientific insights. But let's not kid ourselves. Getting your work recognized in the early 17th century wasn't just a matter of mailing your manuscript to the local journal. Galileo had to play the game, and play it well. Enter Siderius Nuncius, the starry messenger, published in March 1610, a slim volume that packed a punch. It was a sensational hit, the 17th century equivalent of going viral. In it, Galileo detailed his telescopic observations with the kind of clarity and flair that left the academic world buzzing, and not all of it was positive. The book flew off the shelves, and suddenly, everyone who was anyone in the scientific community was talking about those 4 moons. The publication of Siderius Nuncius was a masterstroke. Galileo didn't just present his findings. He crafted a narrative that captured the imaginations of his readers, painting pictures of a universe far more complex and dynamic than anyone had dared to imagine. It was the perfect combination of science and showmanship, and it worked. But let's not forget, this wasn't just an academic triumph. It was a political gamble. Galileo was stepping on some very big toes, challenging the prevailing geocentric model endorsed by none other than the Church itself. And as you might guess, this didn't exactly win him a fan club in Vatican City. Yet, amid the swirling controversies and debates, the economic realities of Galileo's life remained as pressing as ever. Despite the fame and intrigue, he still had to make a living. Patronage was essential, but it wasn't always predictable. The Medici support gave him some breathing room, but Galileo was acutely aware that the political winds could change at any moment. His financial situation was a tightrope act, one bad move away from disaster. This precarious balance between scientific inquiry and financial survival is a theme that resonates even today. Galileo was no stranger to the hustle, and his story is a reminder that the path to knowledge is often littered with economic landmines. Yet, he managed to navigate these challenges with the kind of strategic acumen that would make a modern CEO proud. The impact of Galileo's observations was seismic. The discovery of the Jovian moons was a direct challenge to the Ptolemaic system, which held that all celestial bodies orbited Earth. Galileo's findings provided compelling evidence for the Copernican model, which posited that the planets revolved around the sun. This wasn't just a scientific debate. It was a philosophical and theological one, with implications that reached far beyond the realm of astronomy. Galileo's telescopic discoveries didn't stop at Jupiter. He observed the phases of Venus, which, like the moons of Jupiter, provided further evidence against geocentrism. He also noted that the surface of the moon was not the smooth, perfect sphere that Aristotelian cosmology demanded. Instead, it was pocked with craters and mountains, a celestial landscape as rugged and varied as Earth's own. This was a universe that was alive, dynamic, and infinitely more complex than the static heavens imagined by the ancients. But here's the kicker. Despite the groundbreaking nature of his work, Galileo was still very much a man of his time. He didn't completely abandon the older models of the universe. Rather, he sought to reconcile them with his observations. This isn't the story of a lone genius overthrowing the establishment overnight. It's the story of a man who treaded carefully, maneuvering through the treacherous waters of scientific and religious orthodoxy to advance his vision of the cosmos. As Galileo continued to refine his observations and expand his celestial catalogue, the political and social stakes only grew higher. His work was not just a challenge to scientific conventions, but also to the very authority of the Church, which had long held a monopoly on truth. The drama of Siderius Nuncius was but a prologue to the epic saga that would unfold in the coming years, one that would see Galileo embroiled in controversy, conflict, and ultimately confrontation with the powers that be. But for now, as the ink dried on the pages of Siderius Nuncius, Galileo stood at the forefront of a scientific revolution. His telescope had opened a window to the universe, and through it he glimpsed a cosmos full of mysteries waiting to be unraveled. The sky was no longer a static dome of stars, but a vast, dynamic expanse teeming with discovery. And while Galileo's journey was far from over, his vision of the universe had already begun to reshape the world. As Galileo peered through his telescope, marveling at a universe that suddenly seemed as chaotic as it was vast, little could he know that the real storm was brewing here on Earth. You see, while Galileo's telescope was showing the celestial bodies in a new light, it was about to put him in the spotlight too, and not in a good way. The Church, which had long held a monopoly on the universe's narrative, was about to become less of a spectator and more of an antagonist in Galileo's unfolding drama. Let's set the stage. It's the early 17th century, a time when the Catholic Church wielded its authority like a medieval king swinging a hefty mace. It wasn't just about religion. It was about maintaining social order and control. And here comes Galileo, with his telescope and unorthodox ideas, threatening to upend the Ptolemaic model, a system that conveniently placed Earth, and by extension, mankind, at the center of everything. This heliocentric heresy, first championed by Copernicus, suggested that the Earth revolved around the sun. As if telling the Church they weren't the center of the universe wasn't bad enough, Galileo's evidence-based arguments were gaining traction. And the Church, well, it wasn't exactly in a mood to be upstaged by some guy with a fancy spyglass. Enter the Roman Inquisition. It wasn't just the Church's theological muscle, it was the whole gym. In 1616, they kindly asked Galileo to reconsider his views, or more accurately, to stop teaching them. They didn't burn his books or throw him in a dungeon yet, but they did issue a stern warning. Heliocentrism was a no-go, a prohibited topic, much like politics at Thanksgiving dinner. Galileo, savvy enough to know when to pick his battles, seemed to comply, for a while at least. Fast forward to the 1620s, when Galileo decided to test his luck again. You see, he had friends in high places, and one of them, Cardinal Maffi Barberini, had just become Pope Urban Roman VIII. Now, a buddy in the Vatican isn't exactly a free pass, but Galileo hoped it might at least be a hall pass. Encouraged by Urban's initial tolerance, Galileo penned Dialogue concerning the two chief world systems in 1632. This wasn't just any dialogue. It was a masterclass in rhetorical persuasion, comparing the Ptolemaic and Copernican systems through a fictional conversation. Clever, right, except for one tiny hiccup. The character defending geocentrism was a bit of a dunce and suspiciously resembled the Pope himself. Oops, the book was a hit, but not with everyone. The Church, feeling marked, launched a full-scale inquiry. Galileo was summoned to Rome in 1633, a trip that was as ominous as it was inevitable. Picture him, a 70-year-old man, making the arduous journey across the Italian countryside. It was like sending a seasoned chess player into a match where the opponent had already decided the outcome. The trial was less about science and more about reaffirming power. Galileo was interrogated, threatened, and ultimately coerced into recanting his heliocentric views, a humbling spectacle designed to serve as a cautionary tale. Now, let's debunk a myth. Galileo wasn't a martyr in the dramatic sense. He didn't shout defiance from the stake, nor was he cast into a dungeon to rot. Instead, he spent the remainder of his days under house arrest in his villa near Florence. Not exactly a dungeon, but not the freedom of the cosmos he so loved either. And yet, even in confinement, he continued to write, to think, and to explore the universe in his mind's eye. Why did the Church push back so hard? It wasn't just about the stars or the planets. It was about authority. If Galileo was right, then the Church's teachings were fallible. And in a world where the Church's word was law, admitting error wasn't just a slip-up. It was a seismic shift that threatened the very foundation of its power. Galileo's trial was as much about maintaining the status quo as it was about silencing one man's inconvenient truths. Galileo's story is not just a tale of science versus religion. It's a tale of power, politics, and the peril of challenging the establishment. He was no fool. He understood the game, but sometimes found himself a pawn in it. He wasn't a lone rebel, but rather a man caught in the crossfire of a monumental clash between old-world dogma and new-world discovery. His attempts to navigate this treacherous landscape show a man both bold and cautious, daring and diplomatic. In the end, Galileo's heliocentric vision wasn't extinguished. It was merely postponed, waiting for a world ready to accept it. As the dust settled on Galileo's trial, the dialogue between science and authority continued, a conversation that echoed through the centuries. The trial of 1633 wasn't the end of Galileo's influence. In many ways, it was just the beginning of his enduring legacy. The stars that he tirelessly observed continued their celestial dance, indifferent to the squabbles of earthly powers. Galileo may have been silenced, but his ideas, they were already hurtling through the cosmos, unstoppable as the planets themselves. So, as we leave him in his villa, contemplating the heavens from his garden, remember this. Galileo wasn't just a scientist, he was a catalyst. And sometimes, being a catalyst means enduring the heat of the reaction. And so, Galileo found himself in the twilight of his life, under house arrest, but certainly not at rest. Picture him in his villa near Florence, a place that would be his prison and his sanctuary. House arrest sounds grim, but it was more of a genteel confinement. He wasn't exactly living in luxury, but neither was he in chains. Let's get one thing straight. Even in isolation, Galileo's mind was anything but confined. The universe was still his playground, even if he had to explore it from the comfort of his own home. Galileo wasn't about to let a little thing like house arrest stop him from pursuing science. In fact, he doubled down on his work with an intensity that would make even the most dedicated workaholic look like a slacker. As his eyesight began to fail him, a cruel twist of fate for a man who had spent his life peering into the cosmos, Galileo turned his attention to a different kind of exploration, the study of motion. This was when he penned his final major work, Two New Sciences. Published in 1638, it delved into kinematics and the strength of materials, laying the groundwork for classical mechanics. It was, in essence, Galileo's farewell letter to the scientific community, and it was smuggled out of Italy to be published in the more science-friendly Netherlands. The publication of Two New Sciences was no small feat, considering the Inquisition kept a close eye on Galileo. The book was a culmination of decades of work, and it was a testament to his relentless spirit. Even as his body aged and his vision dimmed, his mind remained sharp, a beacon of intellectual light in a time when darkness threatened to overwhelm. Galileo's work on motion would later catch the eye of another scientific giant, Isaac Newton. Newton famously said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And Galileo was one of those giants, casting a long shadow that would influence physics for centuries to come. But enough about books and papers. Let's talk about legacy. Galileo's life was a masterclass in the complex dance between science and society. He wasn't just a man peering through lenses. He was a pioneer navigating the treacherous waters of religious and political authority. His trials and tribulations were emblematic of the broader struggle between dogma and discovery, a struggle that continues to this day in various forms. Galileo wasn't simply challenging the established order of the heavens. He was challenging the very foundation of authority itself. Fast forward to the 18th century, when the tides began to turn. The Enlightenment was in full swing, and the world was finally catching up to the ideas Galileo had championed. By the time the 19th century rolled around, Galileo was no longer a heretic, but a hero. He became a symbol of scientific bravery, the poster boy for the power of reason over superstition. In 1758, the Catholic Church lifted its ban on books advocating heliocentrism, a small but significant step towards reconciling science and faith. The Church would take its time, fully rehabilitating Galileo's reputation, waiting until 1992 to formally acknowledge its mistakes in handling his case. Talk about holding a grudge. Galileo's story is a reminder that the path to knowledge is fraught with obstacles, but it's also paved with perseverance. His life was a testament to the idea that truth, like the stars, is eternal, even when obscured by clouds of ignorance. The myths surrounding Galileo are tempting, sure. Who doesn't love the idea of a lone genius standing defiantly against the powers that be? But the reality is more nuanced. Galileo wasn't a solitary rebel. He was a savvy navigator of his time, a man who knew when to push and when to pull back. His story is as much about strategy as it is about science. Let's not forget the economic angles here, either. Galileo's life was a roller coaster of financial ups and downs. He was a man who managed to thrive thanks to a mix of intellectual brilliance and social cunning. Patronage was his lifeline, a reminder that innovation often depends on the whims of those holding the purse strings. In a world where wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, Galileo's ability to secure support from the Medici family was as crucial to his success as his scientific insights. As we wrap up this cosmic tale, it's clear that Galileo's legacy was more than just telescopes and trials. He was a catalyst for change, a man whose work transcended the limitations of his time to shape the future. His story is one of human curiosity, courage, and the constant quest for understanding. Galileo's life was a testament to the power of questioning, the importance of evidence, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. So next time you gaze up at the stars, remember Galileo, the man who dared to challenge the heavens, and in doing so, taught us to question the earthly powers that be. His legacy is written in the constellations he so loved, a celestial reminder that while the universe may be vast and mysterious, it is not beyond the reach of human inquiry. And in that vastness, Galileo found his place, not just as a scientist, but as a beacon of what it means to seek knowledge, no matter the cost. In the sweltering jungles of what is now southern Mexico, where the air hangs thick like a forgotten promise, the Olmec civilization began to carve its ambitious mark on history around 1600 BCE. This was no garden-variety tribal gathering. No, the Olmec were the Mesoamerican equivalent of a startup success story. Think Apple, but with more Jaguars and fewer iPhones, setting up shop in the tropical lowlands of the modern-day Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco. These folks were the original movers and shakers of Mesoamerica. Long before the Mayans started scribbling in their codices, or the Aztecs decided human sacrifice was a great way to spend a Saturday, the Olmecs were laying the groundwork for what would be a civilization boom. And boy, did they have some tricks up those toga-like sleeves. First off, let's talk about the Olmec's humble beginnings. We're looking at small farming communities that knew their way around a cornfield. They were all about agriculture before it was cool. growing maize, beans, squash, and maybe even the occasional spicy chili. These early farmers didn't just stumble across the idea of planting seeds. They were more like the original green thumbs of the Americas, coaxing crops from the soil with the kind of determination you'd expect from someone trying to keep their smartphone charged in a desert. As these communities flourished, so did their appetite for innovation. The Olmecs were not just planting crops, they were planting the seeds of a complex society. Their success in agriculture meant they had time and resources to think bigger, much bigger. Enter the colossal heads. These aren't just your run-of-the-mill statues. We're talking about 17 basalt behemoths weighing between 6 and 50 tons each, some of which were dragged over 80 kilometers from the Tuxtla Mountains. Now that's dedication, or maybe just a really intense workout routine. But why carve gigantic heads, you ask? Was it some form of ancient celebrity culture, or did they just have a thing for big faces? The truth is, nobody really knows. Theories abound, ranging from them being portraits of rulers to representations of gods. What we do know is that these heads are as iconic as they are enigmatic, staring out across the centuries with a look that says, yeah, we were here first. Moving beyond art, let's talk trade. The Olmecs were not just local yokels. They were the Jeff Bezoses of their day, setting up extensive trade networks that connected them with distant cultures. They exchanged goods like obsidian jade, and yes, cacao beans, an ancient currency that was probably the only thing tastier than a gold coin. Their trade routes stretched hundreds of kilometers, reaching as far as present-day Honduras and Costa Rica. Picture it, a bustling marketplace where cacao was king and everybody knew the worth of a shiny green jade trinket. This wasn't just about stuff, though. The Olmec trade networks were the highways along which ideas flowed. Their influence can be seen in the arts and architecture of later Mesoamerican civilizations. So, when you see a Mayan pyramid or an Aztec calendar stone, give a nod to the Olmecs. They were the original trendsetters, after all. Now, you might wonder how a society of agriculturalists managed to pull off such feats. Was it magic, divine intervention, or just really good project management? The answer lies in their social and political structure. The Olmecs were ruled by a class of elite leaders who orchestrated these grand projects. These leaders were probably seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people, wielding both spiritual and political power. They guided their society with a deft hand, ensuring that the Olmec civilization not only survived but thrived. In terms of governance, think of the Olmecs as early adopters of a theocratic system. Their rulers weren't just politicians, they were also priests, which meant they had a direct line to the divine, or at least they claimed to. This dual role helped them consolidate power, as they could say, the gods told me to build this massive stone head, and who was going to argue with that? The Olmecs also had a knack for urban planning. Their two major centers, San Lorenzo and La Venta, were marvels of ancient engineering. San Lorenzo, which flourished around 1200 BC, was the first of these centers, and featured an intricate drainage system and artificial ponds. La Venta, which rose to prominence around 900 BCE, boasted a ceremonial complex complete with a pyramid that predates those of the Mayans by several centuries. These cities were the beating hearts of Olmec civilization, showcasing their skill in architecture and planning. But let's not romanticize the past too much. The Olmecs were just as human as the rest of us, capable of making mistakes, and quite possibly the occasional poor life choice. Their civilization eventually declined around 400 BCE for reasons that remain a bit of a head-scratcher. Some suggest climate change, others point to social unrest or warfare. Whatever the cause, the Olmecs left behind a legacy that, while faded, still echoes through the annals of history. And there you have it, the Olmecs, Mesoamerica's original overachievers, setting the stage for the grand civilizations that would follow. They weren't just a footnote in history, they were the opening chapter. So, next time you sip on a cup of hot chocolate, remember those cacao-loving Olmecs who saw value in the beans that give life to your favorite winter beverage. If they could see us now, they might just nod in approval, or they might wonder why we stopped making those giant heads. Either way, their story is one worth telling, face to face. Speaking of giant heads, let's dive right into the rock-solid reality of the Olmecs' most jaw-dropping achievements, their colossal stone heads. Weighing in a casual 6 to 50 tons each, these sculptures are the heavyweight champions of Mesoamerican art. But these bad boys aren't just about flexing artistic muscle. They're a testament to the Olmec's engineering prowess, and let's be honest, their sheer stubbornness. Now, if you're thinking these heads were the result of a casual weekend project, think again. Carving these massive stone noggins was like crafting a Mount Rushmore for the ancient elite, with none of the modern conveniences. The Olmecs sourced their stone from the Sierra de las Tuxtlas Mountains, located about 60 miles away from their main urban centers. Imagine dragging a 20-ton boulder that distance without the luxury of wheels, let alone a truck. The logistics were enough to make even the most dedicated CrossFit enthusiast think twice. So how did they do it? Well, the mythic version might suggest some divine intervention, or perhaps a bit of ancient alien assistance. But the truth is a bit more down-to-earth, and involves a lot more sweat. The Olmecs likely used a combination of manpower and ingenuity, employing wooden rollers, sledges, and ropes to haul these gargantuan stones across the landscape. It was the ultimate team-building exercise, minus the trussed falls. And let's not forget the carving itself. This wasn't a quick whittle with a pocket knife. It was a meticulous process requiring skill and patience. Armed with stone tools, Olmec artisans chipped away at the basalt with the kind of precision that would make Michelangelo nod in respect. Each head, with its unique features and expressions, suggests they weren't just random busts, but likely portraits of rulers or revered figures. In a society where your head size didn't dictate your importance, these sculptures were a big deal, literally and figuratively. Now, you might wonder what the Olmecs got out of this Herculean effort. Beyond the obvious, hey, look what we can do factor, these heads likely had significant social and political implications. They were symbols of power, a way for leaders to cement their legacy in stone, literally. In a world where the gods and ancestors held sway over daily life, having your likeness immortalized in such a grand manner was the ultimate status symbol. But let's not carve their gods out of the picture. The Olmecs had a pantheon that could have been ripped from the pages of a prehistoric comic book. Their deities were an eclectic mix, with jaguar features and baby faces often making an appearance. The Olmec dragon, the maize god, and the feathered serpent were just a few of the divine figures that populated their myths. These gods weren't just for decoration. They were central to the Olmec worldview, influencing everything from agriculture to politics. Religion wasn't just a Sunday affair. It was woven into the very fabric of Olmec society. The elite class, those guys with the stone heads, claimed divine right to rule, aligning themselves with these powerful deities. This theocratic setup gave them a double dose of authority, both political and spiritual. It was a system that kept the wheels of society turning, or in this case, the stone heads rolling. Sacred rituals and ceremonies were essential to maintaining this divine connection. The Olmecs believed in keeping the gods appeased, which sometimes meant elaborate offerings, and perhaps the occasional bloodletting. It wasn't all sunshine and maize. Religion could be a serious, sometimes grisly business. But in a world where natural disasters and crop failures could spell doom, keeping the divine forces on your side was just good policy. In many ways, the Olmec civilization was like the blueprint for later Mesoamerican cultures. Their religious beliefs, artistic expressions, and political structures set the stage for the Mayans, Aztecs, and others who would follow. Yet, for all their achievements, the Olmecs remain shrouded in mystery. Their script, tantalizingly close to decipherment, remains largely unreadable, leaving us to piece together their story from the stones and artifacts they left behind. So as we move forward, remember the Olmecs not just for their colossal heads, but for the colossal impact they had on Mesoamerican history. They were pioneers, not only in art and religion, but in creating a society that could move mountains, or at least really big rocks. In the end, their legacy is etched in stone, a silent testament to a civilization that knew how to make a statement, and what a statement it was. And speaking of making statements, let's dig into the daily grind of the Olmec civilization. What did these ancient pioneers get up to when they weren't busy chiseling out stone heads or offering up their best harvest to a feathered serpent? Spoiler alert, they weren't lounging around binge-watching the latest Obsidian tablet series. No, life in 1200 BCE was a delicate dance between survival and celebration, a bit like living in a perpetual state of festival preparation, minus the poorer parties and overpriced concession stands. First off, let's talk about corn, the superstar of the Olmec diet, and the original superfood that would make any modern health guru nod approvingly. Maize wasn't just a crop. It was the backbone of their existence, the fuel that powered everything from their laborious construction projects to their bustling trade networks. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a power bar, but without the fancy packaging or questionable aftertaste. And it's no surprise that corn was the cornerstone of their diet. It was versatile, nutritious, and most importantly, abundant. The Olmecs didn't just toss corn on the cob over a fire and call it a day. Oh no, they were culinary innovators, grinding it into masa to make tortillas, tamales, and other corn-based delights that would make any foodie's heart sing. This wasn't just sustenance. It was an art form, a testament to their ability to coax the most out of the land. But corn wasn't the only item on the menu. Beans, squash, and chili peppers added variety, while the occasional deer or fish provided a protein punch. It was a diet that kept them robust enough to drag 20-ton boulders across the countryside, after all. Now, let's switch gears and talk about leisure, because even the most industrious society needs to unwind. And for the Olmecs, unwinding often meant engaging in a bit of friendly competition, ball games to be precise. Picture this, a game that was part sport, part ritual, and perhaps a smidge more intense than your average pickup basketball game. The Olmec ball game wasn't just about scoring points. It was a cultural phenomenon that echoed through the ages, influencing later civilizations like the Maya and the Aztecs. Using a rubber ball, yes, they had rubber, thank you, natural latex from rubber trees, players would compete in a game that was equal parts skill and spectacle. The rules are a bit murky, like trying to decipher a game of Calvin ball, but it likely involved keeping the ball in play using hips and forearms, all while avoiding the dreaded out of bounds. Imagine a high-stakes blend of soccer, volleyball, and wrestling with a dash of divine significance. Because, in true Olmec fashion, these games were more than just a way to blow off steam. They were tied to religious ceremonies and could even play a role in political negotiations. Think of it as ancient diplomacy, but with more bruises and fewer PowerPoint presentations. But let's not sugarcoat it. Olmec life wasn't all fun and games. Theirs was a society that knew hardship, where natural disasters could wipe out a year's harvest, and social hierarchies were as rigid as their stone sculptures. The Olmecs lived in a world where the whims of nature and the gods dictated their fate. It was a reality that required resilience and adaptability, traits that the Olmecs had in spades. Now, here's where we dive into the juicy part, the decline of the Olmec civilization. Cue the dramatic music and speculative theories, because this is where history gets as tangled as a ball of yarn in a kitten's paws. By around 400 BCE, the Olmec civilization began to fade, leaving behind more questions than answers. Was it climate change that did them in, with shifting weather patterns turning fertile lands into barren fields, or perhaps social unrest, an internal conflict tore at the fabric of their society, unraveling it from within? Then there are the more outlandish theories. Cue the ancient aliens and Atlantis enthusiasts. Some suggest that external invaders swept in, toppling the Olmec elite and scattering their people. Others propose that a catastrophic event, like a volcanic eruption or massive flood, wiped the slate clean. While these theories make for great storytelling, the truth is likely less sensational and more rooted in the complex interplay of environmental and social factors. The Olmecs, for all their achievements, were not immune to the challenges that have toppled civilizations throughout history. What we do know is that their influence lingered long after their cities fell silent. The Olmec legacy lived on in the cultures that rose from their ashes, carrying forward their innovations in agriculture, architecture, and art. The echoes of their ball games and the taste of their maize are woven into the tapestry of Mesoamerican civilization. So, while the Olmecs may have vanished from the pages of history, their impact is anything but forgotten. As we pause to consider the Olmec's daily life, filled with the rhythms of work and the joy of play, we're reminded that history is never a simple tale. It's a complex narrative of triumphs and trials, of people striving to make meaning in a world that was often as unpredictable as it was beautiful. And as we continue to unravel the mystery of the Olmecs, one thing is clear. Their story is a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, a legacy etched not just in stone, but in the very fabric of Mesoamerican history. So, As we leave the Olmecs basking in the afterglow of a well-played ball game, with corn in their bellies and dreams in their hearts, let's remember that history is not just about the grand narratives. It's about the small moments, the daily lives that shaped a civilization. And as we continue our journey through the ages, let's carry forward the spirit of the Olmecs, the daring, the innovation, and yes, even a touch of the mysterious. Because if there's one thing the Olmecs have taught us, it's that history is anything but set in stone. As we leave the Olmecs basking in the afterglow of a well-played ball game, with corn in their bellies and dreams in their hearts, it's time to dive into the Olmecs' greatest hits, those cultural innovations that made them the bay and say of ancient Mesoamerica. Because let's face it, being the founding fathers of a civilization isn't just about moving big rocks and playing ball games. It's about leaving a legacy that can make even the toughest critics nod in grudging admiration. First up, we have the Olmec writing system. Now, you might think the Olmecs were all brawn and basalt, but they also had a flair for the written word, or at least the carved one. Picture this: intricate symbols etched into stone, like the ancient world's version of a tweet, but with more gravitas and zero hashtags. Early Mesoamerican glyphs, found on artifacts like the Cascadule block, suggest the Olmecs were among the first to develop a form of writing in the Americas. This stone slab, discovered not in a dusty corner of a forgotten temple, but rather in a gravel pit, because history loves irony, is inscribed with 62 distinct symbols, many of which defy easy interpretation. Imagine trying to decipher your doctor's handwriting. Now add a few millennia of erosion and a language barrier. You get the picture. And while we can't quite read their messages yet, the existence of this proto-writing system tells us volumes. It suggests a society that valued record-keeping, communication, and maybe even a touch of bureaucracy. Who knows? Perhaps they had ancient memos about the proper technique for dragging colossal heads or recipes for the perfect maize porridge. Whatever the case, this early writing effort marks the Olmecs as intellectual trailblazers, paving the way for later civilizations like the Maya to script their own tales of glory and sacrifice. Next, let's talk about time. The Olmecs' impressive knack for it, to be precise. These folks weren't just content with watching the sun rise and set. No, they were all about the calendar game, laying the groundwork for the sophisticated timekeeping systems that would become a hallmark of Mesoamerican cultures. Their calendar was likely based on observations of celestial bodies, with cycles that would eventually evolve into the famous 260-day and 365-day calendars used by the Maya. And while we don't have an Olmec farmer's almanac to confirm planting schedules, their understanding of time was crucial for planning agricultural and religious activities, ensuring that corn was planted at the right moment and the gods received their due homage without a hitch. But wait, there's more. The Olmecs weren't just visionaries of the written word and time. They were architectural innovators too. Their urban centers, like San Lorenzo and La Venta, weren't built on whims. These sites were meticulously planned, with ceremonial plazas, monumental architecture, and even early forms of pyramids that would inspire the grander structures of the Maya and Aztecs. Take La Venta's Great Pyramid, for instance, a 34-meter-tall earthen mound that predated those Mayan sky-high wonders you see in every travel brochure. It's like the Olmecs were saying, "Hey, we got here first. Now go build something even cooler." And let's not forget about their knack for art. Beyond those larger-than-life stone heads, Olmec artisans crafted intricate jade figurines and masks that have survived the test of time. These green gems were the ancient world's equivalent of a Cartier watch, symbols of wealth, power, and prestige. In a society where bling wasn't just for show, possessing such items likely marked you as someone who mattered, someone who could influence both earthly and divine realms. Now, you might be wondering how the Olmecs spread these ideas far and wide. Well, the secret source was their extensive trade networks, the ancient Mesoamerican version of the Silk Road, minus the camels and Marco Polo. Through these routes, Olmec innovations traveled like whispers on the wind, reaching distant lands and leaving their mark on cultures from the Zapotecs to the Maya. It wasn't just goods that were exchanged on these highways of commerce. It was ideas, styles, and rituals. This cultural cross-pollination helped seed the vibrant tapestry of Mesoamerican civilization. And here comes the myth-busting part. While some might romanticize the Olmecs as mystical sages, the reality was more grounded. They were practical people who knew that trading a chunk of jade for cacao beans could mean the difference between a good harvest festival and a total washout. They understood that aligning a pyramid with the stars wasn't just about cosmic vibes, but about ensuring their society thrived in harmony with nature's cycles. In essence, the Olmecs were pragmatists with flair, balancing the mystical with the mundane in a way that would resonate through the centuries. It's easy to gloss over the Olmecs when talking about the grandeur of the Maya or the might of the Aztecs, but to do so is to miss the point. The Olmecs were the original influencers, the ones who set the stage upon which later Mesoamerican civilizations would perform their grand dramas. They deserve more than a passing mention in history books. They deserve a standing ovation for their role in shaping the world as we know it. As we pause to appreciate the Olmecs' contributions, let's not forget that their story is far from over. The echoes of their achievements continue to ripple through time, reminding us that history is a living, breathing entity. And as we continue to unearth the secrets of this enigmatic civilization, one thing is certain. The Olmecs will forever hold a place in the pantheon of great historical innovators, head and shoulders above the rest, quite literally. As we bask in the afterglow of the Olmecs' monumental achievements, let's turn our gaze to the broader lessons they offer us. Because let's face it, the Olmecs weren't just about hauling giant stone heads like some ancient cross-fit champions. Their story is a masterclass in resilience, innovation, and the sheer stubbornness of the human spirit, qualities that resonate just as much today as they did 3,000 years ago. First, let's debunk a myth or two. It's tempting to romanticize the Olmecs as mystical sages, whispering secrets of the universe while crafting jade sculptures with divine inspiration. But let's keep it real. The Olmecs were people like you and me, just trying to navigate the chaos of life. They didn't have the luxury of a how to build a civilization for dummies guide. What they did have was resourcefulness in spades. When the going got tough, they didn't sit around waiting for a miracle. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work, sometimes quite literally rolling those massive boulders across the landscape. Take their agricultural prowess, for instance. The Olmecs knew that a society runs on its stomach. They transformed swamps and jungle into productive farmland long before it was cool. With corn as their cornerstone, they crafted a diet that fueled not just survival, but prosperity. In today's terms, they were the ultimate locavores, turning local ingredients into culinary staples that sustained entire communities. And their innovation didn't stop at the dinner table. Olmec engineers devised complex drainage systems to manage the unpredictable whims of Mesoamerican weather, ensuring that their crops and civilization didn't wash away with the next big storm. Now, if the Olmecs could somehow time travel to our world of Wi-Fi and avocado toast, they'd probably be amazed, and maybe a little confused. Imagine explaining the concept of a smart home to someone who thought a sophisticated dwelling was a hut with a thatched roof that kept out the rain. Would they marvel at our technological wonders, or would they scratch their heads at our obsession with screens and social media? They might chuckle at our avocado toast, but they'd surely appreciate its reliance on staple crops, something they could get behind, even if they preferred their tortillas to come sans Instagram filter. And let's talk about innovation. The Olmecs weren't content to simply exist. They were inventors at heart. From their early writing system to their advanced understanding of astronomy, they laid the groundwork for future societies to build upon. They understood that knowledge wasn't just power, it was survival. The stars weren't just pretty lights in the sky. They were guides for planting and harvesting, a celestial calendar that dictated the rhythms of life. In a world where the next meal was never guaranteed, the Olmecs' ability to plan and predict was nothing short of revolutionary. Their legacy is an enduring reminder of the complexities of human societies. The Olmecs teach us that civilizations aren't built overnight, nor are they the product of a single vision. They are the result of countless decisions, big and small, made by people trying to make sense of the world around them. And while their civilization eventually faded, their influence lived on in the cultures that followed. The Mayans, the Aztecs, they all owe a debt to the Olmecs, whose innovations in agriculture, urban planning and trade set the stage for the grand civilizations of Mesoamerica. But let's not kid ourselves. the Olmecs weren't perfect. Their society, like ours, had its share of flaws. The rigid hierarchies and theocratic rule that enabled such remarkable feats also sowed seeds of tension and unrest. Their story is a cautionary tale about the costs of power and the dangers of placing too much authority in too few hands. Yet, even in their imperfections, the Olmecs offer valuable insights into the human condition. They remind us that progress is often messy, a series of missteps and breakthroughs, of trial and error. In that way, the Olmecs were just like us, eternally striving, occasionally stumbling, but always reaching for something greater. As we wrap up our journey through the annals of Olmec history, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. The Olmecs were more than just ancient sculptors and farmers. They were pioneers in every sense of the word. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of human innovation and the unyielding drive to carve out a legacy, no matter the obstacles. They remind us that history isn't just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry woven from the lives of those who dared to dream. And so, as we close the chapter on this remarkable civilization, let's carry forward the spirit of the Olmecs, their creativity, their resilience, and yes, even their occasional flair for the dramatic. Because if there's one thing the Olmecs teach us, it's that history isn't just about where we've been, it's about where we're going. And in a world that's constantly changing, that lesson is more relevant than ever. So here's to the Olmecs, the original trailblazers, whose story continues to inspire and whose legacy endures, etched in stone and in the hearts of those who dare to dream. The story of Henry Roman VIII begins with a twist worthy of a soap opera. He wasn't supposed to be king. Seriously. Born on June 28, 1491, Henry was the second son of Henry Roman VII and Elizabeth of York. The original heir to the throne was his older brother, Arthur, who not only had the name of a legendary king, but also the expectations to match. Arthur was the golden boy, and Henry was free to pursue leisure activities like jousting, hunting, and maybe the medieval equivalent of binge-watching Netflix. Now, Arthur was set to marry Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess with enough royal connections to make LinkedIn jealous. The marriage was a political power move, intended to solidify an alliance with Spain. But in 1502, just 5 months after the wedding, Arthur died suddenly at Ludlow Castle, possibly from the sweating sickness, a disease so mysterious and trendy in Tudor England that it could have its own Instagram account. Cue the dramatic music. Henry, the spare heir, was now the main event. At this point, Henry was just 10 years old, probably more interested in his next game of tennis than running an entire kingdom. But fate had a different game plan. Fast forward to April 21, 1509, when Henry Roman VII kicked the royal bucket, and our young Henry ascended to the throne at the ripe age of 17. Picture a teenager today suddenly inheriting a Fortune 500 company. Terrifying, right? Yet, young Henry embraced it with gusto, ready to flex his muscles, both literally and politically. Speaking of muscles, Henry was quite the athlete. Standing over 6 feet tall, he was the medieval version of a sports superstar, often seen in the tilt yard showing off his skills in jousting. He was also an avid hunter and a talented musician, supposedly riding the popular tune Pastime with Good Company, a Tudor chart topper if there ever was one. Henry had big dreams for England, envisioning it as a major European power. He was charismatic, charming, and for a while, a hit with the ladies. But let's talk about Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his late brother. To maintain that all-important Spanish alliance, Henry was betrothed to her in a move that had all the romance of a corporate merger. They tied the knot on June 11, 1509, just a few weeks after Henry became king. Catherine, 6 years his senior, was smart, pious, and politically savvy. She was basically the Hermione Granger of the Tudor court, and their marriage was initially painted as a fairy tale. Spoiler alert, it was more Grimm Brothers than Disney. Catherine had to swear up and down that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, a claim as scrutinized as the latest celebrity scandal. The Pope gave his blessing, and the match was sealed. For a while, they were the medieval power couple, even co-ruling while Henry was off playing soldier in France. But behind the facade of royal bliss, there was one glaring problem: no male heir. Sure, they had a daughter, Mary, but in the 16th century, a female heir was about as desirable as a lead balloon. Henry wanted a son like a modern billionaire wants a super yacht. This was partly because of the Wars of the Roses, which had brought enough family drama to rival a Kardashian holiday special. Henry had grown up in the shadow of this conflict, understanding all too well the importance of securing a male heir to avoid another bloody civil war. As the years passed, and Catherine's chances of producing a son dwindled, Henry started to see their marriage as more curse than blessing. Despite the lack of a male heir, Catherine held her own in the political arena. She even served as regent in 1513, leading England in Henry's absence and scoring a major victory against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. She was not just a pretty face, but a formidable partner in governance. Yet the fairy tale was crumbling. Henry's eye began to wander, and whispers of annulment started swirling around the court. But we'll save the juicy details of that saga for another time. In the meantime, Henry was busy envisioning England as a Renaissance powerhouse, commissioning grand palaces and patronizing the arts. This was a guy who could appreciate a good tapestry as much as a good joust. His court was a glittering hub of culture and innovation, a blend of chivalric romance and ruthless ambition. As the young king juggled his athletic pursuits, marital challenges, and political aspirations, he set the stage for a reign that would be as dramatic as it was consequential. But remember, folks, this is just the beginning. Stay tuned for more of Henry's wild ride through history, with our young king juggling court life like a Tudor version of Cirque du Soleil. It's time to dive deeper into the marital bedlam that defined Henry Roman VIII reign. Picture a royal soap opera so juicy it would make even the most seasoned daytime drama producer blush. Henry's obsession with a male heir was not just a personal obsession, it was a dynastic necessity. In his eyes, a male heir was the only surefire way to prevent England from slipping back into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Having a daughter, Mary, was like buying insurance that only covered sunny days. Henry needed a policy for the stormy weather, and he was willing to rewrite all the rules to get it. Enter Anne Boleyn, the court's new it girl. Anne was everything Catherine wasn't, younger, flirtier, and decidedly more enigmatic. She was the Tudor version of a social media influencer. Everyone wanted to be her, or be with her. Anne was a lady-in-waiting to Catherine, but soon she became much more than that to Henry. She played hard to get, refusing to become just another mistress. She demanded a crown, and Henry, smitten and desperate, was ready to comply. But there was a small snag. To marry Anne, Henry needed an annulment from Catherine, and the Pope wasn't exactly handing those out like party favors. The papal refusal was the ecclesiastical equivalent of being left on read. Frustrated, Henry decided to take matters into his own hands. This was a man who once penned a book defending the Catholic Church against Martin Luther, earning him the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope himself. Talk about irony. In a plot twist for the ages, Henry broke from the Catholic Church and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Imagine turning your back on your best friend and then throwing a party with all their friends. That's essentially what Henry did to the Pope. The break from Rome was a seismic shift in European politics, but it wasn't just about swapping religious hats. It was a financial windfall. With the Act of Supremacy in 1534, Henry not only gained a new wife, but also access to the church's vast wealth. The dissolution of the monasteries was like hitting the jackpot. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry systematically dismantled over 800 religious houses, pocketing an estimated £3 million, equivalent to about £800 million today. Talk about a lucrative divorce settlement. The move also allowed Henry to redistribute land and wealth to his supporters, consolidating his power and silencing potential critics. It was a win-win if you didn't count the displaced monks and nuns. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The marriage to Anne wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The courtship had been a whirlwind, but the marriage quickly veered into tempest territory. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, in 1533, but no sons followed. Remember, Henry was after a boy, not a sequel to his daughter Mary. Anne's failure to produce a male heir quickly turned the royal honeymoon into a nightmare. By 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, an accusation list that reads like a medieval tabloid cover. The evidence was flimsy at best, But Henry was done with Anne. Her execution on May 19, 1536, was swift and brutal, marking one of the most infamous miscarriages of justice in history. With Anne out of the picture, Henry married Jane Seymour just 11 days later. Talk about moving on. Jane was the calm after the storm, the vanilla after 2 scoops of Rocky Road. She was everything Anne wasn't: demure, obedient, and crucially, fruitful. In October 1537, Jane gave Henry his long-awaited son, Edward. Champagne corks popped across the kingdom, but the celebrations were short-lived. Jane died just 12 days after childbirth, leaving Henry distraught yet again. Despite his grief, Jane was considered his true wife, the one who bore him a son, and she was the only one given the honor of a queen's burial. Henry's personal life was a revolving door of matrimony, but his religious and political maneuvers left an indelible mark on England. The creation of the Church of England was not just a means to an annulment. It was a reimagining of English governance and spirituality. The economic implications were profound. The crown's coffers swelled, and the redistribution of monastic lands created a new class of gentry. Yet the social fabric of England was irrevocably altered. The monasteries had been centers of education, charity, and healthcare. Their dissolution left a void that Henry's financial gains couldn't fill. The irony of it all: Henry, the self-styled defender of the faith, had torn down the very institution he once vowed to protect. He had been the Catholic Church's golden boy, yet his reign saw the Protestant Reformation take root in England. His actions set the stage for decades of religious conflict, culminating in the tumultuous reigns of his children. Henry may have been a king of contradictions, but he was nothing if not a man of action. In his quest for a male heir, he not only reshaped the English monarchy, but also the nation's spiritual and economic landscape. As Henry marched through marriages like a man on a mission, his reign became a cautionary tale of power, passion, and politics. The quest for a son was his white whale, driving him to feats of audacity and acts of brutality. Yet, in his relentless pursuit, he laid the groundwork for modern Britain, for better or worse. The story of Henry Roman VIII is far from over, and as we move forward, the stakes only get higher. Stay tuned for more of the king's roller coaster reign as we unravel the tapestry of his life and times. Henry Roman VIII's turbulent love life was like watching a royal reality show where the stakes were life and death, and there were no roses to give out, only execution orders. After the death of Jane Seymour, Henry found himself a grieving but pragmatic widower. He was still a king, after all, with a kingdom to run and a dynasty to secure. Next on Henry's matrimonial hit list was Anne of Cleves, a political pawn in an attempt to ally with the German Protestant states. Picture a royal dating app where instead of swiping right, you send a painter to capture your likeness. Enter Hans Holbein, the Tudor Tinder artist, whose flattering portrait of Anne convinced Henry that she was a catch. But when Anne arrived in England in 1540, Henry was less than impressed. This was the medieval equivalent of a heavily filtered profile picture, and the reality left Henry cold. The wedding went ahead, but the union was about as warm as a Tudor winter. Henry famously described Anne as a Flanders mare, proving that even kings can be terrible at first impressions. The marriage was annulled after just 6 months on the politically convenient grounds of non-consummation. Anne, surprisingly, came out of this debacle relatively unscathed. She was granted a generous settlement, including Hever Castle, was dubbed the king's beloved sister. Not a bad gig, considering the alternatives. While Anne of Cleves was enjoying her single life with a nice castle and a royal pension, Henry moved on to Catherine Howard, a lively young lady who was everything Anne wasn't: charismatic, flirtatious, and crucially English. Their whirlwind romance was the talk of the court, but Catherine's past wasn't exactly squeaky clean. Rumors of her previous dalliances and indiscretions followed her to the altar, and the court was abuzz with whispers and intrigue. Catherine's story is a cautionary tale of youthful exuberance meeting royal paranoia. Her past caught up with her when her indiscretions were brought to Henry's attention by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The king, initially besotted, turned cold as stone. The charges of adultery were serious business, and Catherine found herself in a web of accusations that she couldn't escape. In February 1542, Catherine met a grim end, executed for treason. She was just 19, and her brief stint as queen was a stark reminder of the perils of Tudor court life. With 2 wives down and a reputation that could rival any soap opera villain, Henry moved on to Catherine Parr, his 6th and final wife. Catherine was a wise choice for a king who had more ex-wives than some people have had heart dinners. She was intelligent, well-educated, and had a calming influence on Henry's increasingly volatile temper. Catherine was also a widow twice over, which meant she had experience in navigating the treacherous waters of marriage. Catherine Parr outlived Henry, which is saying something, given his marital track record. She was a stabilizing force in his life, acting as a stepmother to his children, and even helping to reconcile him with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Under her influence, the royal family began to heal, and Henry's later years were marked by a semblance of domestic tranquility, at least by Tudor standards. The court of Henry Roman VIII was a place where fortunes could change as quickly as the English weather. It was a world of opulence and splendor, but beneath the gilded surface lay a brutal reality. The Tower of London, once a royal palace, became a grim symbol of Henry's reign, where many of his wives and courtiers met their end. The stakes of court life were high, and the price of failure was often paid in blood. Henry's reign was a masterclass in the art of political maneuvering. His marriages, while seemingly driven by personal desire, were also strategic moves in the complex chess game of European politics. Each wife brought with her alliances, dowries, and potential heirs, making marriage a matter of state as much as of the heart. While we often remember Henry as the king with an insatiable appetite for wives, it's crucial to acknowledge the larger tapestry of his reign. His matrimonial escapades were just one thread in a rich and complex narrative that saw England transformed from a medieval backwater into a burgeoning Renaissance power. Henry's court was a microcosm of the changing world, where the old ways were giving way to new ideas, and where the personal was always political. As we continue our exploration of Henry's reign, it's essential to remember that the king's quest for love and legacy was more than a personal drama. It was a reflection of a society in flux, grappling with issues of power, faith, and identity. Henry's story is a reminder that history is not just about kings and queens, but about the world they shaped and the people who lived in it. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the reign of Henry Roman VIII, a king whose life was a testament to the power of ambition, the danger of excess, and the enduring quest for immortality. There's more drama, intrigue, and scandal to uncover as we unravel the legacy of one of England's most infamous monarchs. As we transition from Henry Roman VIII's chaotic love life to his twilight years, the picture isn't pretty. Think of it as the Tudor version of a rock star's burnout phase. By the time Henry hit his mid-40, the once strapping athlete had morphed into a man who could barely squeeze into his armor. His waistline ballooned to an impressive 54 inches, thanks to a diet that would make even the most indulgent foodie blush. We're talking about a guy who could down a dozen courses in one sitting, washed down with gallons of ale and wine. Henry's physical decline wasn't just a dietary disaster. The jousting accident of 1536 was the real game-changer, leaving him with a festering leg wound that stubbornly refused to heal. It was a medieval medical nightmare, complete with pus and gangrene that made every step excruciatingly painful. Imagine trying to rule a kingdom with a leg that was as cooperative as a toddler at bedtime. This leg injury was more than just a personal inconvenience. It was a catalyst for Henry's paranoia. He became increasingly suspicious of those around him, convinced that everyone had an agenda. And let's be real, in the cutthroat world of Tudor politics, he wasn't entirely wrong. His court was a snake pit of ambition, where alliances shifted as quickly as the English weather. Henry's paranoia spilled over into his governance. He ruled with an iron fist, using his network of spies and informants to sniff out potential threats. The execution of Thomas Cromwell in 1540 is a prime example. Cromwell, the man who had helped engineer Henry's break from Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries, met his end at the chopping block after falling out of favor. It was a brutal reminder that in Henry's England, loyalty was as fleeting as the king's patience. Speaking of loyalty, let's talk about Henry's attempts to secure his legacy through his children. By the 1540, Henry was acutely aware of his mortality. He had 3 legitimate heirs, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, but the question of succession was as tricky as a Tudor riddle. Mary, a devout Catholic, was a political liability in a Protestant-leaning England. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was Protestant, but carried the stigma of being Anne Boleyn's daughter, a scandal that still lingered like a bad smell. And then there was Edward, the long-awaited male heir, but he was just a kid. So, what's a king to do? Henry's solution was the Third Succession Act of 1543, a piece of legislation that was as convoluted as it was crucial. It restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, after Edward, of course. This was Henry hedging his bets, ensuring that if Edward didn't make it to adulthood, his daughters could step up to the plate. The act was a political masterstroke, but it also highlighted the instability of Henry's legacy, not exactly the solid foundation any king dreams of leaving behind. Economically, Henry's reign was a mixed bag. On one hand, he'd filled the royal coffers through the dissolution of the monasteries, pocketing a jaw-dropping £1, 3 million. On the other hand, his military campaigns were a financial black hole. The war with France from 1544 to 1546, for instance, cost England a staggering £2 million. To put that in perspective, it's like flushing your savings down the Thames. The result was an economy that was as inflated as Henry's waistband, with rampant debasement of the currency causing prices to skyrocket. Henry's health and paranoia also affected his foreign policy. His alliances were as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. One minute, he was cozying up to Francis I of France. The next, he was plotting to seize Boulogne. His diplomatic strategies were driven as much by personal vendettas as by national interests, making England's position on the European stage both unpredictable and precarious. In the domestic sphere, Henry's later years saw a crackdown on religious dissent. The king who had once championed reform now found himself caught between Catholic conservatives and radical Protestants. The 6 Articles of 1539, known as the Bloody Whip with 6 strings, was Henry's attempt to enforce religious conformity, punishing any deviation with severe consequences. It was a tightrope walk between maintaining order and stoking unrest, and it left England's religious landscape as fragmented as ever. Amid this turmoil, Henry's legacy was still a work in progress. On one hand, he had reshaped England, expanding its naval power and laying the groundwork for its future empire. On the other hand, his reign was marked by personal and national turmoil that left scars on the kingdom's psyche. His quest for a male heir had driven monumental changes, but at what cost? As Henry entered his final years, he was a king who had achieved much and lost even more. His physical decline mirrored his waning influence, and his once dominant presence was now a shadow of its former self. But even as his health failed, Henry remained a force to be reckoned with, a ruler whose impact on England was as indelible as it was contentious. As we inch closer to the end of Henry's reign, the stakes are higher than ever. The king's legacy hangs in the balance, and the question of what kind of England he will leave behind looms large. With his health deteriorating and his ambitions unfulfilled, Henry's final chapter promises to be as dramatic and unpredictable as the rest of his life. So buckle up, because the ride isn't over yet. There's more intrigue, more scandal, and more history to uncover as we delve deeper into the life and times of England's most infamous king. So, as Henry Roman VIII days dwindled like a candle burning at both ends, the stage was set for a succession drama that could rival any modern-day TV cliffhanger. By January 28, 1547, the once mighty king finally succumbed to his ailments, leaving behind a throne as precarious as a game of Jenga missing all but the base blocks. His death marked the end of an era, but the aftershocks of his reign were just beginning to ripple through the kingdom. Enter Edward, VI, the much-anticipated male heir, but don't break out the coronation champagne just yet. Edward was a mere 9 years old when he ascended to the throne, making him the Tudor equivalent of a child star thrust into the limelight without a stage mom. With a minor wielding the scepter, the real power landed in the hands of the Regency Council, led by his uncle, the Duke of Somerset. This was less of a smooth transition and more of a political free-for-all, with various nobles elbowing for influence like it was Black Friday at the Tudor Mall. Now, Edward's reign might have been short-lived, spanning only 6 years, but it was packed with religious roller coasters. The young king was a staunch Protestant, steering England further from its Catholic roots with the zeal of a teenager on a social media crusade. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced in 1549, a move as divisive as pineapple on pizza. While some embraced the change, others longed for the days of incense and Latin, leading to uprisings like the Prayer Book Rebellion. But before Edward could leave a lasting mark, he was snuffed out by tuberculosis in 1553 at the tender age of 15. Cue another succession crisis. Edward's deathbed attempt to sidestep his Catholic sister Mary by naming Lady Jane Grey as his successor was the political equivalent of a Hail Mary pass. It failed spectacularly, leaving Jane as a 9-day queen, a tragic footnote in the Tudor tale, executed as much for her Protestant faith as for her brief flirtation with power. Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, then ascended the throne, determined to reverse her brother's reforms. Her reign was a bloody chapter in the Tudor saga, earning her the moniker Bloody Mary for her ruthless persecution of Protestants. Over 280 were burned at the stake during her 5-year reign, a grim reminder that religious fervor often comes with a side of fanaticism. Mary's marriage to Philip Roman II of Spain was meant to bolster Catholicism, but instead fueled fears of Spanish domination, leaving her deeply unpopular. Yet, amidst the turmoil, Mary made a poignant move. She reinstated her sister Elizabeth to the line of succession, a decision that would shape England's future more than any of her policies. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth I's ascension marked the dawn of a golden age for England, a testament to the unpredictable twists of Tudor politics. Now, let's dial back to Henry for a moment. The legend of Henry Roman VIII often paints him as a larger-than-life figure, a king whose appetites, both literal and metaphorical, were as grand as his ambitions. But was Henry really the formidable monarch history remembers, or was he more of a royal train wreck with a penchant for drama? Spoiler, it's a bit of both. Henry was undeniably charismatic, a king who could charm a courtier one minute and condemn them the next. Yet his reign was riddled with contradictions. He was a master of rebranding, reinventing himself from a defender of the Catholic faith to the head of the Church of England with a swipe of his quill. Economically, Henry's dissolution of the monasteries was a short-term windfall, but a long-term liability. The wealth he amassed lined the pockets of his supporters, but left England with a gaping hole in its social safety net. The monasteries had been more than just religious centers. They were the medieval welfare state, providing education, healthcare, and charity to the poor. Henry's grab for cash might have funded his wars and palaces, but it also sowed seeds of discontent that would bloom in later years. Politically, Henry's reign set a precedent for absolute monarchy, a legacy that would haunt his successors. His knack for eliminating rivals and consolidating power was a double-edged sword, leaving the Tudor dynasty both stronger and more isolated. His court was a microcosm of intrigue, where alliances shifted with the winds and heads rolled with alarming regularity. Culturally, Henry's court was a crucible of the Renaissance, a melting pot of art, music, and literature. His patronage of the arts left an indelible mark on English culture, a legacy that outlived his turbulent reign. But let's not romanticize it too much. For every Holbein portrait, there was a grim reality of political purges and religious persecution. So, why does Henry Roman VIII endure as a figure of fascination? Perhaps it's the sheer audacity of his life. A king who defied popes, redefined faith, and reshaped a nation with the flair of a rock star. His story is a cautionary tale of powers, corrupting allure, and the human cost of ambition. Henry's legacy is a mirror, reflecting both the glory and the folly of his age. His reign was a masterclass in the art of reinvention, a testament to the enduring allure of the Tudor mythos. As we wrap up this Tudor saga, let's reflect on the lessons we can glean from Henry's life. History, much like Henry's waistline, is expansive and complex. It reminds us that power is as fleeting as fame, and that the decisions of one ruler can echo through the ages. Henry's story is a reminder that beneath the trappings of royalty lies a simple truth. The past is a tapestry woven with both triumph and tragedy, and understanding it is the key to understanding ourselves. So, as the curtain falls on the life and times of Henry Roman VIII, we leave behind a king whose legacy is as tangled as his family tree. The echoes of his reign still reverberate today, a testament to the enduring power of history's most colourful characters. And while Henry may have left this world as a battered, broken monarch, his story endures, a vibrant, chaotic chapter in the book of England's past. And with that, we close the book on Henry Roman VIII, a king who lived life to the fullest and left behind a kingdom forever changed by his rule. As we drift off to sleep, may we dream of a past filled with intrigue, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of legacy. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, history never truly rests. If you ever thought your family gatherings were chaotic, welcome to the Roman pantheon, where even the gods had more drama than a reality TV reunion. The Romans worshipped a staggering number of deities, each with their own special quirks and responsibilities, like a divine office full of overachievers. And just like that friend who borrows your Netflix password but never offers to pay, the Romans had no qualms about borrowing gods from their neighbors. The catch: they gave them snazzy new Latin names, because why bother with originality when you can rebrand? Take Jupiter, for instance. He's basically Zeus, but with a toga and a Roman accent. This king of the gods had all the thunderbolts and none of the subtlety. His role was to keep order, which was ironic considering the Olympian-level chaos his family was known for. You see, in Roman religion, the gods were not just distant celestial beings. They were as involved in human affairs as your nosy next-door neighbor, albeit with a lot more firepower at their disposal. Now, for the Romans, religion wasn't a personal choice, like deciding whether you're more of a coffee or tea person. It was a state affair, and the altar was the original social media platform. Sacrifices and rituals were public spectacles, and if you think modern influencers are attention-seeking, ancient Romans were practically inventing the concept. They believed the gods needed to be appeased with offerings, and the more extravagant, the better. It was like hosting a lavish party for someone who might not even show up, but you couldn't afford to take that chance. Religious festivals were where the real action happened. These events were the Coachella of the ancient world, minus the flower crowns, but with plenty of animal sacrifices. The Romans had a penchant for grand celebrations, and why not? When the gods could smite you with a flick of their wrist, a little indulgence seemed wise. The Ludi Romani, for instance, was a festival held in September that combined chariot races with theatrical performances, a bit like if NASCAR decided to throw in a Broadway show for good measure. The expenses could rival those of a modern music festival, but instead of overpriced merchandise, you might end up with a goat's entrails on the altar. Speaking of costs, sacrifices weren't cheap. A bull, for example, could set you back several hundred sesterces, which was no small change considering a Roman soldier earned about 900 sesterces annually. It's a bit like splurging on a VIP ticket when you're still paying off student loans. But these rituals weren't just about emptying your wallet. They were deeply embedded in the social and political fabric of Rome. Think of them as a way to curry favor with both the gods and your fellow citizens. It's PR, ancient style. And let's not forget the political angle. In Rome, religion and politics were as intertwined as spaghetti on a fork. Holding a religious office was a surefire way to climb the social ladder. The Pontifex Maximus, for instance, was a position of immense power, a role so influential that Julius Caesar himself held it. The office was less about theological expertise and more about wielding influence. It's a bit like becoming a high-ranking official without having to pass a single theology exam. Talk about a sweet gig. The Romans were pragmatic about their deities, too. They didn't just pray for good harvests or victories in battle. They sought divine guidance on everything from traffic jams, well, chariot pileups anyway, to ensuring the right auguries before a big decision. Imagine checking your horoscope before launching a military campaign. In this way, religion was less about piety and more about practicality. Yet, for all the pomp and circumstance, Roman religion was also about maintaining the Pax Deorum, or peace of the gods. This was a delicate balance, akin to keeping a group of temperamental celebrities happy on an awards night. The slightest misstep in a ritual could spell disaster, an unintentional snub that might incur divine wrath. It's like making sure the lead singer gets their specific brand of bottled water, or else the show won't go on. In the end, the Romans' religious practices were a reflection of their society, complex, hierarchical, and deeply intertwined with their daily lives. From the grand festivals that rivaled any modern-day carnival to the serious business of appeasing gods with the right kind of sacrifice, religion in Rome was both a public spectacle and a personal safeguard. And in a world where a single storm could ruin crops or a war could shift the balance of power, having the gods on your side was more than just desirable. It was essential. So, while the gods might have had their spats and dramas, the Romans knew one thing for certain. Keeping them happy was the ultimate key to success. And speaking of keeping the gods happy, let's dive into the economic engine that powered all this divine appeasement, the temples. If you ever thought GoFundMe was a modern marvel, think again. In ancient Rome, temples were not just places of worship. They were the original crowdfunding platforms with a twist. These sacred spaces were often the heart of a community where people could donate to curry favor with the gods, or at least hedge their bets against divine displeasure. Picture this, a bustling Roman market, with vendors hawking everything from olives to amphorae. Amidst the chaos, the temple stood as a beacon of order, a place where commerce and spirituality intersected in fascinating ways. Temples were often the wealthiest institutions in a city, accumulating vast resources from donations, fines, and even loans. Yes, you heard it right. Temples operated like ancient banks. You could deposit your wealth there for safekeeping, and in return, they might lend it out to others at a modest interest rate. It was a win-win, unless, of course, you crossed the guards, in which case, well, good luck retrieving your assets. Now, don't imagine these priests as your typical robe-wearing mystics. No, these folks were savvy operators, managing temple finances with a keen eye on profit margins. They had side hustles that would make a modern influencer green with envy. From selling surplus sacrificial meat to leasing out temple land for farming, they knew how to monetize piety. It's a bit like your favorite YouTuber expanding into a merch line, except the priests had the added benefit of divine endorsement. And let's not forget the merchandise. Statuettes, amulets, and other religious paraphernalia were heart sellers, especially if they promised a little extra luck or protection. Speaking of sacrifices, let's talk about the price of devotion. A sacrificial bull could set you back a pretty penny. Think several hundred sesterces. For context, a Roman soldier earned about 900 sesterces a year, so sacrificing a bull was no small feat. It was a bit like splurging on a luxury car when you're still paying off the mortgage. But hey, if it meant keeping Jupiter or Mars on your side, many Romans thought it was worth the investment. These sacrifices were often public affairs, with the whole community gathering to witness the ritual and share in the bounty. After all, who doesn't love a free feast, especially when it comes with the added bonus of divine protection? Now, let's shift our gaze to one of the most exclusive religious gigs in town, the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses were the creme de la creme of Roman religious life, handpicked from noble families to serve Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. Becoming a Vestal Virgin was like winning the lottery, albeit with a few strings attached. For starters, they had to commit to 30 years of service, during which they were sworn to celibacy and charged with keeping the sacred fire of Rome burning. Failure to do so could result in dire consequences, both for the city and for the unfortunate Vestal. But don't let the celibacy clause fool you. This was no monastic life. Vestals enjoyed privileges that would make a modern influencer swoon. They had front row seats at games and festivals, could pardon criminals, talk about power moves, and were treated with a level of reverence usually reserved for royalty. Financially, they were set for life, thanks to generous stipends and gifts from grateful citizens. It was a sweet deal, provided you could handle the pressure of being both a celebrity and a guardian of Rome's spiritual well-being. The Vestals were the ultimate paradox, revered, yet constantly scrutinized. Their lives were a delicate dance, balancing public duty with personal sacrifice. The economic side of Roman religion was as complex as a modern-day stock exchange, with a dash of divine intervention thrown in for good measure. Temples were the heart of this system, serving as both spiritual and economic powerhouses. And while the priests and Vestals navigated these waters with aplomb, for the average Roman, religion was less about theology and more about practical concerns. It was a way to ensure stability in an unpredictable world, a means of securing favor from the gods, and by extension, from one's fellow citizens. Yet, beneath all the pomp and ceremony lay a stark reality. The Roman religious system was as much about control as it was about devotion. By intertwining religion with politics and economics, Rome ensured that its citizens remained loyal and compliant. It was a masterstroke of social engineering, a testament to the pragmatic genius of a civilization that knew how to play the long game. So, while the image of a devout Roman sacrificing a bull might evoke romantic notions of piety, the truth was far more complex, and dare I say, a tad cynical. As we unravel the tapestry of Roman religion, it becomes clear that the economic dimension was not just a footnote, but a driving force. The temples and their priests, with their flair for finance and showmanship, were the linchpins of this system. They were the original entrepreneurs, using faith as their currency and influence as their product. And in a world where power and prestige were often just as important as divine favor, they knew exactly how to play their cards. As we unravel the tapestry of Roman religion, it becomes clear that the economic dimension was not just a footnote, but a driving force. The temples and their priests, with their flair for finance and showmanship, were the linchpins of this system. They were the original entrepreneurs, using faith as their currency and influence as their product. And in a world where power and prestige were often just as important as divine favor, they knew exactly how to play their cards. Now, let's dive headfirst into the high-stakes game of political chess played by those at the top of the Roman food chain. If you thought modern political campaigns were a circus of spin and spectacle, the ancient Romans were the original ringmasters. Forget about kissing babies or shaking hands. These guys were all about courting the gods themselves. And standing at the pinnacle of this divine popularity contest was none other than Augustus, the first Roman emperor who mastered the art of cosmic PR. Augustus, or Octavian before his rebranding, was a man who knew how to work a crowd, even if that crowd included the celestial beings above. After the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, Augustus claimed to be the son of a god, Julius Caesar, posthumously deified. It was a little like running for office with your campaign poster featuring a selfie with Zeus. Augustus was savvy enough to realize that aligning himself with the divine was not just an ego trip, but a strategic move to solidify his power. By tying his lineage to the gods, he wasn't just a ruler, he was practically a demigod, a move that left his political rivals scrambling to keep up. But Augustus didn't just stop at familial name-dropping. Oh no, he took it a step further by instituting a series of religious reforms that were as much about governance as they were about piety. He revived traditional Roman religious practices and restored decaying temples, all while building new ones with a flair that screamed, "Look at me, I'm besties with the divine." One of his crowning achievements was the Temple of Mars Ultor, a massive structure completed in 2 BCE that served as a testament to his military exploits and divine favor. This wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about crafting a narrative where Augustus was not just a man, but a bridge between mortals and immortals. And if you think that's where the theatrics ended, think again. Augustus also revamped religious festivals, turning them into must-attend events that doubled as political rallies. The secular games of 17 BCE, for instance, were an extravagant affair that mixed traditional sacrifices with games and performances, pulling in crowds from across the empire. It was the Coachella of its day, minus the pop stars, but with plenty of divine pageantry. Augustus was a master at making religion a public spectacle, ensuring that his name was on everyone's lips, and his image was etched into the very fabric of Roman society. Yet, beneath this dazzling show of divine endorsements lay a cold, calculated strategy. By positioning himself as not only a political, but also a religious leader, Augustus effectively blurred the lines between the state and the divine. It was a power play that ensured loyalty not just through fear or force, but through a sense of divine duty. The emperor wasn't just a ruler. He was the custodian of Rome's spiritual well-being, and questioning his authority was akin to questioning the gods themselves. It was a brilliant, if not cynical, move that secured his legacy and set a precedent for future emperors. Speaking of emperors playing dress-up, let's not forget Caligula, who famously declared himself a god. If Augustus laid the groundwork with class, Caligula bulldozed through it with sheer audacity. In a move that would make even the most narcissistic influencer blush, Caligula had a temple erected in his own honor, complete with a statue of himself dressed as Jupiter. It was less about worship and more about ego, a monument to one man's delusion of grandeur. And while it made for great gossip, it also highlighted the dangerous intersection of power and piety, where divine favor could be spun into a weapon of control. In this arena of divine dress-up, the emperors wielded religion like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a tool for unity, forging a shared identity among Rome's diverse populace. On the other, it was a means of control, a way to justify authority that went beyond mere human leadership. By wrapping themselves in the mantle of divine favor, these rulers ensured that their power was not just respected, but revered. It was a political masterstroke that kept the imperial machine humming along smoothly, even as the line between sacred and secular became increasingly blurred. But let's not forget that this divine Game of Thrones came with its own set of risks. The same divine endorsements that bolstered an emperor's standing could also be a double-edged sword. A single misstep in ritual, a bad omen, or the displeasure of the gods could turn the tide of public opinion faster than you can say, sacrificial lamb. Emperors had to walk a tightrope, balancing their celestial connections with the very real demands of governance. The stakes were high, and the consequences of failure were often catastrophic. Yet, for all the pomp and circumstance, the reality was that Rome's divine endorsements were less about piety and more about pragmatism. Religion was the ancient equivalent of a political campaign, complete with all the trimmings of modern-day spin and spectacle. The emperors were not just leaders. They were brand ambassadors for the divine, crafting narratives that ensured their legacy long after they were gone. It was a testament to the power of belief, both in the gods above and in the leaders who claimed to be their earthly representatives. As we continue our journey through the complex world of Roman religion, it's clear that the divine wasn't just a backdrop, but a central player in the theater of power. From Augustus' calculated charm offensive to Caligula's audacious self-deification, the emperors of Rome knew how to play the game of divine endorsements with aplomb. And while their methods may seem extravagant, even absurd, they were grounded in a cold, hard reality. In a world where power and prestige were often as fleeting as the favor of the gods, the ability to harness divine backing was the ultimate trump card. So, as we pull back the curtain on this ancient stage, one thing is abundantly clear. In the grand spectacle of Roman religion and politics, the emperors were the ultimate ringmasters, wielding divine favor like a master illusionist. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the intricate dance between power, piety, and the ever-elusive favor of the gods. Now, speaking of divine favor and its cosmic ramifications, let's dive into one of Rome's most enduring myths, the tale of Romulus, the legendary founder of the city. Ah, Romulus, the poster child for ancient Rome's bustling myth machine. According to legend, Romulus and his twin brother Remus were abandoned as infants and raised by a she-wolf. Yes, you heard that right, a wolf. Now, before you picture a Disney-esque scene with a wolf playing the nurturing nanny, let's unpack this a bit. Romulus' wolfish upbringing is one of those stories that perfectly straddles the line between myth and marketing. In reality, the tale was likely a creative spin on the more mundane practice of exposing unwanted infants, leaving them to the elements, a grim but real aspect of ancient life. The she-wolf, or *lupa*, was probably inspired by a local legend or even a metaphorical reference to a woman of ill repute, since the term also referred to a prostitute. It's a bit like claiming your great-great-grandfather was raised by bears when he actually just lived near a bear-infested forest. Romantic, sure. Factual, hardly. The Romulus story was an early example of Rome's flair for myth-making, a narrative crafted to give the city a divine origin and an air of destiny. After all, what better way to stake your claim as the eternal city than by saying you were founded by a man raised by nature's fiercest guardian? This legend wasn't just a bedtime story. It was ancient Rome's version of a brand-building exercise, providing a shared identity for its citizens while bolstering its prestige in the ancient world. But hold on to your laurel wreaths, because the Romans were masters at spinning tall tales to suit their needs. They understood that a well-crafted myth could be more powerful than 1,000 truths. Take the legend of Aeneas, a Trojan hero said to be the ancestor of Romulus and Remus. This story linked Rome to the epic saga of Troy, bestowing upon it a sense of grandeur and continuity. In reality, Aeneas was a literary creation by Homer, later borrowed by the Romans to add a touch of Iliad-esque drama to their lineage. Now, while these myths painted Rome in a golden glow, daily religious life was often a tad more earthy. The Romans were notorious for their superstitions, a web of beliefs that dictated their actions as surely as any law. Forget about black cats or broken mirrors. Romans had a catalogue of omens that would rival any modern-day horoscope. You see, they had a knack for interpreting the world around them through a lens of divine signs. This wasn't just casual superstition. It was risk management, ancient style. Imagine this. You're a Roman senator about to embark on a crucial journey. But wait, a bird flies in the wrong direction, or a priest misinterprets the entrails of a sacrificial animal. Suddenly, your trip is off the calendar. It seems absurd to us, but for the Romans, these omens were a serious business. They were seen as messages from the gods, and ignoring them could mean courting disaster. In a world without Google Maps or weather forecasts, these signs were the ancients' way of hedging their bets against an unpredictable universe. The practice of augury, interpreting the will of the gods through the behavior of birds, was a revered art in Rome. Augurs, though specially trained to read these signs, held significant sway over public and private decisions alike. If the augurs gave a thumbs down, plans could be halted faster than a bad movie review on Rotten Tomatoes. It might sound like a quaint tradition, but the stakes were real. Bad omens could lead to political upheaval, military defeat, or public panic. And it wasn't just birds and guts. Romans also relied on astrology, dreams, and even sneezes to guide their decisions. Yes, a sneeze at the wrong moment could be a deal-breaker. These superstitions, however, weren't just about placating the gods. They reflected a society deeply engaged with its environment, seeking to find order amidst chaos. In a world as unpredictable as ancient Rome, reading the signs was as vital as keeping your sword sharp. Yet, while the Romans might have been superstitious, they weren't naive. They understood the power of belief and how it could be wielded like a weapon. Leaders and generals often manipulated omens to their advantage, declaring divine favor to rally troops or sway public opinion. Julius Caesar, for example, famously claimed to have seen a vision of his victory at the Battle of Pharsalus. It's the ancient equivalent of, "I had a dream last night, and guess what? I'm going to be the next big thing." This clever manipulation of divine messaging wasn't just the domain of the powerful. Everyday Romans engaged in rituals and practices to ward off misfortune, from wearing protective amulets to reciting incantations. These everyday acts were less about deep religious conviction and more about covering all bases. After all, when you're living in a city that could be sacked or burned at any moment, a little extra luck never hurt. So, while the myths of Rome paint a picture of legendary founders and divine favor, the reality was a bit less glamorous and a lot more grounded. Romans navigated a complex web of beliefs, balancing their legendary past with the gritty realities of daily life. They understood that, while stories of she-wolves and heroic ancestors were great for the history books, in the here and now, it was the omens and the augurs that often held the real power. As we look further into the tapestry of Roman religion, it becomes evident that the line between myth and reality was as blurred as a watercolor painting. The Romans lived in a world where the gods were both distant legends and intimate presences, where myths were not just stories, but tools for navigating the complexities of life. And in this dance between the epic and the everyday, the Romans found a way to make sense of their world, even if it meant occasionally attributing their fates to the flight of birds or the whims of a wolf. In the end, Roman religion was less about dogma and more about pragmatism, a reflection of a society that knew how to blend myth with reality to create a narrative that served both its citizens and its rulers. As we continue to peel back the layers of this ancient civilization, the interplay between belief and power, myth and reality, becomes ever more fascinating, revealing a world where the divine was both a comfort and a tool, and where the stories we tell can be as powerful as the gods themselves. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the Roman psyche, exploring how these beliefs shaped not just a city, but an empire. Now that we've taken a deep dive into the rich tapestry of Roman religion, it's time to shake things up with the ultimate game changer, Christianity. Picture it as the plucky startup that crashes the market, turning the established order on its head like a Silicon Valley disruptor at a rotary phone convention. Let's set the scene. It's the 1st century AD, and the Roman Empire is a sprawling colossus stretching from Britain to Egypt. Amidst this grandeur, a new faith is quietly gaining traction, one that doesn't require you to appease a pantheon of gods with an endless parade of sacrifices. Enter Christianity, a monotheistic faith that promises salvation without the need for extravagant offerings or the right auguries. If Roman religious practices were the blockbuster movies of their day, filled with spectacle and special effects, Christianity was the indie film with a compelling narrative that resonated on a personal level. But the rise of Christianity wasn't just about theology. It was also a social revolution. For the lower classes, who couldn't afford the luxury of sacrificing a bull every time they sneezed the wrong way, Christianity offered a more accessible path to spiritual fulfillment. The economic appeal was undeniable. Salvation without draining your cestus's. It was like switching from a gas-guzzling chariot to an eco-friendly vehicle. The allure of a single, all-powerful deity who cared about you as an individual was a seismic shift from the capricious and often aloof Roman gods. Now, let's talk numbers. By the early 4th century, Christians comprised about 10% of the Roman population, a testament to the faith's viral growth despite periods of intense persecution. The turning point came with Emperor Constantine, who in 313 AD issued the Edict of Milan, effectively legalizing Christianity. It wasn't just a political move. It was a masterstroke in social engineering. Constantine saw the writing on the wall, or perhaps the cross in the sky, as legend has it, and realized that the future lay with this burgeoning movement. By 300 AD, under Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity became the state religion of Rome, officially sidelining the old gods to the status of mythological has-beens. This transition wasn't just a spiritual phenomenon. It had profound economic and social implications. Temples that once stood as the financial hubs of Roman cities found themselves repurposed or abandoned. The elaborate festivals and sacrifices, which had drained public coffers and personal fortunes alike, were gradually phased out. Instead, the church began to fill the void, not only as a spiritual center, but as a new kind of community hub. Collections and charity replaced lavish sacrifices, a more sustainable model in both economic and spiritual terms. But let's not romanticize this shift too much. The rise of Christianity wasn't an overnight miracle. It was a bumpy road filled with conflict and compromise. Pagan practices didn't just disappear, they were absorbed and rebranded. Take the Roman festival of Saturnalia, a December celebration marked by feasting and gift-giving. Sound familiar? It should, because many of its customs were cleverly woven into the fabric of Christmas. The church, much like a savvy marketer, understood the value of meeting people where they were. While the gods of old were downsized, the architectural legacy of Roman religious practice lingered on. Basilicas, originally Roman public buildings, were repurposed as Christian churches. The grandeur of Roman engineering, with its imposing columns and vast domes, found a new purpose in the service of the Christian faith. It's a bit like finding a vintage record player at a garage sale and realizing it sounds better than your modern Bluetooth speakers. The echoes of this transformation still resonate in our world today. Our calendar, for starters, remains a tapestry woven from both Roman and Christian threads. The names of the months and days, from January honoring Janus to Sunday for the sun god, coexist with Christian holidays like Easter and Christmas, which have their roots in ancient seasonal festivals. Even our architecture, with its neoclassical facades and Corinthian columns, pays homage to the grandeur of Roman religious structures. So, what does this all mean for us modern folk, navigating a world that feels as chaotic as any Roman forum? The legacy of Roman religious practices, with their blend of myth and reality, spectacle and spirituality, offers us a mirror to examine our own beliefs and practices. It reminds us that the stories we tell, whether of gods or tech startups, have the power to shape our societies in ways both profound and unexpected. The Romans, with their knack for blending pragmatism with pageantry, teach us that religion, and indeed belief as a whole, is often less about the divine and more about the human need for connection and meaning. Whether it's the dramatic rituals of Jupiter or the quiet introspection of Christian prayer, these practices are reflections of our desire to understand the world and our place within it. As we wrap up this journey through Roman religious history, let's leave with a final thought. The past, with all its quirks and contradictions, is never truly past. It's a living tapestry, woven with threads of myth and reality, faith and doubt. And in that intricate weave, we find the stories that continue to shape our world, echoing across the ages with a resonance that is both ancient and timeless. So, next time you glance at a calendar or admire a lofty column, remember, the Romans were here, and their legacy is far more than ruins. It's a testament to the enduring power of belief, in whatever form it takes.